dreams, I walk free in the city streets. 2,500 days plus 50 weeks, doing hard time for these WikiLeaks, trying to bring the truth out. Man, it only gets you heat, and then they gag you. You don't get to speak, and when you get the leak, they try to hit delete. The masses of the masses, they want the shit discreet. That's why my middle finger's up to these sick elites. Free speech, it's the freedom of press. Take your deepest, darkest secrets, never leave them unsaid. If I'm a thief, then I'm a thief for the people you dread. The people of the red, white and blue, you keep them in bed. Seeing the sheep, keep them asleep, deceiving the weak. Keep seeking the leaks till you cease, and I see your defeat. Until I'm deceased underneath a freezing red sheet. Become a dead man, then I hit the switch and release. When Goldman Sachs is your creditor, you kill the messenger. Stories axed by the editor, you kill the messenger. Pay to play on the regular, you kill the messenger. Need a solace, any questioners, you kill the messenger. And outside my window a figure quickly creeps. They dark as night like some motherfucking chimney sweeps. Whiskey with my Mickey keeps dying in my kidneys weak. Silence in my risky tweets is what the grand jury seeks. I'm wanting peace like 7 years in Tibet. Now rest in peace like 7 years under threat. Cause I've released 7 vaults, they upset. They ended the rape sentence, but the US still insists to rest. I guess it's a sin to take the truth and disseminate. MLK to Gandhi, take aim and eliminate. And I don't say I'm great, just wanna say what's fake. But if they kill me, a million others will take my place. The CIA's post like a knife the sharpest. All hypocrisy, lies, and heartless. They want to stop me, my life make my heart quit. Cause democracy dies in the darkness. When Goldman Sachs is your creditor, you kill the messenger. Stories axed by the editor, you kill the messenger. Pay to play on the regular, you kill the messenger. Need a solace, any questioners, you kill the messenger. When the vote count is irregular, you kill the messenger. You caught spying on a senator, you kill the messenger. Removing voters from the register, you kill the messenger. Need a solace, any questioners, you kill the messenger.
Kill the messenger. Kill the messenger. Kill the messenger.
In my dreams, I walk free in the city streets. 2,500 days plus 50 weeks, doing hard time for these WikiLeaks, trying to bring the truth out. Man, it only gets you heat, and then they gag you. You don't get to speak, and when you get the leak, they try to hit delete. The masses of the masses, they want the shit discreet. That's why my middle finger's up to these sick elites. Playing on the regular,
You kill the messenger.
free speech is the freedom of press. Take your deepest, darkest secrets, never leave them unsaid. If I'm a thief, then I'm a thief for the people you dread. The people want the red, white and blue, you keep them in bed. Seeking the sheep, keep them asleep, deceiving the weak. Keep seeking the leaks till you cease, and I see your defeat. Until I'm deceased underneath a freezer red sheet. Become a dead man, then I hit the switch and release. When Goldman Sachs is your creditor,
You kill the messenger.
And outside my window a figure quickly creeps. They dark as night like some motherfucking chimney sweeps. Whiskey what my Mickey keeps, dying in my kidneys weak. Silence of my risky tweets is what the grand jury seeks. I'm wanting peace, like 7 years in Tibet. Now rest in peace, like 7 years under threat. Cause I've released 7 vaults, they upset. They ended the rape sentence, but the US still insists to rest. I guess it's a sin to take the truth and disseminate. And I'll pay the Gandhi, take him and eliminate. And I don't say I'm great, just wanna say what's fake. But if they kill me, a million others will take my place. The CIA's post like a knife the sharpest. All hypocrisy, lies, and heartless. They want to stop me, my life make my heart quit. Cause democracy dies in the darkness. Cause democracy dies in the darkness. You kill the messenger. You kill the messenger. Democracy dies in the darkness. Feeling cold now, I got the heater on. Feeling sold out, even though I'm keeping strong. But can I hold out when every bit of freedom's gone? They want me rolled out, never to sing freedom song. I wanna see the sky, I wanna feel the rain. But gotta keep away from windows, that's some window pane. It's just a shame, couldn't have planned out all our dreams. Now I scream, cause there's a man in the machine. But the train is off the tracks, and damn it's losing steam. I wanna call Christine, I haven't seen since 013. I'm missing life like 3 strikes each night. Seems like 3 nights ain't right. Can't fight, space light, hate life. Wanting to be snake-like, shedding off this gray life. In the dark can't make light, but where I'm headed now is brake lights. Where I'm headed now they break lights. Counting days like brake lights. Feeling weight like brake lights. Had a great life. Brake lights, brake lights, brake lights. Out of place like brake lights. In my face like brake lights. Counting days like brake lights, brake lights, brake lights. Sit here asking, what have I done? If these strings were cut, I'd see my son. And if I could just fly from this place, then I'd hold you in my love embrace. And if I could just speak to you now, I'd renew my vow and be in the now. Is this me in denial? Wanna remove stress from your brow and pay you back some way, somehow. But it's painted black, can see the way back now. But how's the house and how's your mom? I doubt the way the media portrays me makes you hate me. But to think you see that daily makes me crazy, that just ain't me.
This is without a doubt going to be this generation's Free Mandela movement. Every single generation must fight again the same battles that previous generations have fought.
Brake lights, counting days like brake lights, brake lights, brake lights, brake lights, brake lights, brake lights. Brake lights, brake lights, brake lights.
He was screwing Bernie Sanders. And he said, just like the Pentagon Papers put a different view on Vietnam, those emails that WikiLeaks published put a different view on Hillary Clinton. Now, we can, in this hyper-partisan time, he was screwing Bernie Sanders. You could take this hyper-partisan view that this is Giuliani, a Republican, a right-wing Republican. In this hyper-partisan lawyer was screwing Bernie Trump, a right-wing president. And of course, they think that WikiLeaks helped him, Hillary Clinton, lose and get Trump into office. Of course, WikiLeaks published these nice things about. Well, there's a couple of problems with that. Number one, Trump's Secretary of State, when he was CIA director, Mike Pompeo, called WikiLeaks a non-state foreign intelligence asset or agency, which is a ridiculous statement. We discussed that with Ray last week. So these Sessions, when he was Attorney General, certainly wanted Julian Assange as well. So people within the Trump administration want Julian Assange. What's significant about this is that Giuliani has Trump's ear. That's why this was an important story. It wasn't just somebody out of government or who he'd been obviously former New York mayor and a federal prosecutor before that. This is a guy who talks to Giuliani almost every day, to Trump every day. And he's taken a principled position here. We have to dismiss the partisanship here. He's right. And he could have an influence on Trump. And if Trump shows some guts, as he's starting to show more or less here or there, this could be a significant development. So I want to bring in now both Ray McGovern and Margaret Kimberly. And what they have in common with me is that we're all native New Yorkers. Margaret is the only one who's not an expat. She's still in New York. Ray and I are Bronxites. And I don't know if Ray was in New York. I was during the Giuliani years, and I presume Margaret was. So we know Rudy Giuliani. And I doubt that any of the three of us are fans of Rudy Giuliani, the way he was mayor and when he ran for president, how he tried to exploit 9/11, the whole 9 yards. We know about Rudy Giuliani. But we have to set that aside. And I wonder if both of you agree that this was a significant statement by Giuliani, and there's a glimmer of hope here that he could influence Trump's thinking on this.
Well, I would like to think that he can, but unfortunately, well, there's two things. He does not have any official position in government, so his opinion doesn't really count more than anybody else's. Trump is pretty much discredited, and because the Democratic Party, first of all, they began this whole thing saying that, first of all, they lost because of Russia, and they lost because the DNC email was carried out by Russians, and they gave materials to Julian Assange. And it's treated by the corporate media as fact, not even as an allegation. So what all this means, unfortunately, is that the pressure would be on Trump not to help Assange, even if he's of the same opinion as Giuliani. He's fighting against impeachment, and if he were to do anything favorable for Assange, it would be a nail in the coffin for him. I think Republicans might abandon him. So I would like to think I'm sorry to throw cold water on everything, but I'm not sure that it really, in the end, that it means very much. Trump is in a tough spot. And to help the person who is almost single-handedly blamed as being responsible for the Democrats' defeat I don't think it's something he would take a chance and do.
Well, the person who's single-handedly responsible for Hillary Clinton losing is Hillary Clinton.
Of course.
So let's talk to Ray McGovern now about this, Ray. What's your take on Giuliani?
Oh, Joe, I think that's unkind. Hillary Clinton could not have, all by herself, rescued defeat out of the jaws of victory. No, it had to be some kind of extraneous factor. I speak of the HWHW virus, which has now been very virulent for 2 whole years. There's no antidote for it. That's the Hillary would have won virus. It's set in full strength right after the election in 2016, and it's going big and strong. Now, whom does Hillary blame? Well, first she blamed James Comey, the FBI director, and then of course she blamed WikiLeaks. And does she have a case at all? Did WikiLeaks do something that could have hurt her? Well, yeah, sure they did. Uh, you know, Julian has this uncanny ability to just sit there in the Ecuadorian embassy in London and people leak things to him. People put in little thumb drives into their computers, as was the case with the DNC emails, and they copy it onto this thumb drive and then they give it to Julian. So now, is it likely, in my view, is it likely that by publishing these literal emails that no one has disavowed as being inauthentic, real as could be, these emails that showed, I think, as you mentioned, Joe, that Hillary did everything she could with some success to steal the nomination from Bernie Sanders, did they have an effect on the election? Who knows? But my guess is, yeah, they probably did. But what's the connection with Russia? What's the connection with Russia? Well, we're selective, we intelligence analysts, in what we cite as sources. But you don't do any better than a sitting president of the United States. And most people don't know this, but Barack Obama, 2 days before he left office, had a press conference. And gratuitously, he said, that intelligence community assessment, we're coming up on the 2-year anniversary of it now. It was 6 January 2017. That intelligence community assessment that said that the Russian hackers, so-called, gave their information to WikiLeaks, well, those conclusions are inconclusive. Oh, wait a second. Is that a quote, Ray? Yeah, that's a quote. That's what Barack Obama said 2 days before he left. The conclusions of the intelligence community as to how WikiLeaks got this information are inconclusive. Now, has anyone pursued that? Has anyone asked Obama? You were briefed 13 days before that, on the 5th of January, by the Gang of Four. Clapper, Director of National Intelligence; Brennan, head of the CIA; Comey, head of the FBI; and Admiral Rogers, head of the NSA. Those were the ones that constructed this intelligence assessment. How can you contradict their main conclusion that it was WikiLeaks? Not only WikiLeaks, but the Russians, not only the Russians, but Vladimir Putin himself. Well, how can you? Has anyone asked Obama that? Well, Joe, maybe you could do that. You're an enterprising reporter. Somebody needs to get into Obama's circle and say, you appeared to be convinced by this briefing. The briefing was given to President-elect Trump the next day. And so why would you say the conclusions were inconclusive? Now, I had an experience today that was really amazing. I was talking to a high-level congressional staffer. And I mentioned that, this was really doubtful that the Russians were responsible or that proof could be adduced. She said, of course the Russians hacked. Of course they hacked. And I said, what's your evidence? And she said, oh, everybody knows. New York Times, Washington, everybody knows that the Russians hacked. And I said, well, maybe they did, but where's the evidence? Now, a recent chance that I had to talk about this was with none other than the former National Intelligence Director, James Clapper. He came out into the open at a Carnegie Endowment event on the 13th of November. And he was advertising his book, and luckily I got there a little bit ahead of time and I got the book and I looked up and I thought, oh my God, there he goes. He says, when he was in charge of all the imagery before the war in Iraq in 2003, when it broke out, he admits in a book, he says, we knew what the administration wanted to hear. And The blame needs to be apportioned to the administration officials, but also us, including me in intelligence, who tried so hard to please that, quote, we said things were there that weren't there. Wow. We said things were there, like weapons of mass destruction, that weren't really there. So I asked him after he was finished, I said, now, I read that with great interest in your book. Fast forward to just 2 years ago, when you were working for Obama, you briefed him on the 5th of January, 2017, and you told him that the Russians hacked and we had the evidence and so forth. Is this another case? Is this an analogous case, Mr. Clapper, where you were so eager to please, that is, your masters, Obama, Clinton, and the others, that you found things that weren't really there? Well, nobody was happy with me. Well, very few were happy with me at the Carnegie Endowment. But what did he say? What did he say? Well, number one, he said, well, I don't know why Obama would have said that after I briefed him. And number two, he said, no, it's not. No. We have forensics. He said, we have forensics. Well, if they have forensics, I want to see those forensics, because we, veteran intelligence professionals for sanity, also have forensics, all right? We not only have forensics, but we have proof in black and white, proof, literal proof that this Guccifer 2 entity, the one that after Julian Assange said he had emails relating to Hillary Clinton, 2 days later, CrowdStrike, Hillary Clinton's computer whiz-bang folks, said, aha, we think the Russians did it, and here's some telltale signs about that. The next day, Guccifer 2.0 arises out of the ashes and says, we know that CrowdStrike is right because we did it. We, Guccifer 2.0. Well, we don't know who Guccifer 2.0 is. We don't know whether we should use he or she or it. We're non-sexist when it comes to Guccifer 2.0. But what we do know is that Guccifer 2.0 is a fraud, an out-and-out fraud. And I'm speaking of our two former technical directors of the NSA who are with us in our Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity group, they can prove, and I've seen the spreadsheets, that Guccifer 2 is a fraud from the get-go. And so what does that mean? Well, that means that everything that they say relying on Guccifer 2.0 can be cast away because he's a fraud. You mean indictments? Like indictments of the 12 apostles, not 12 apostles, the 12 GRU people? Yeah, right, that's right. Because Guccifer 2 lies at the bottom of that. So it's pretty bad. And the worst, of course, is that we can demonstrate all this. We can actually get it into a fairly mainstream publication like the progressive The Nation, right? Which we did in August of 2017. But the people up there in New York at The Nation and people all over, especially the Democrats, are so infected by the HW virus, that's the Hillary would have won virus, that there was a rebellion in The Nation. And so they had to challenge the conclusions that we gave to Patrick Lawrence, who was the excellent writer of this article. And there was a kind of brouhaha, and there was a big sort of thing. And the publisher and the editor said, well, I have all these progressives. They have the HW virus, but what can I do? They work for me. And so she let other people challenge us, other people that had nowhere near the expertise. So Binney and Ed Loomis, our two former technical directors of the NSA, have. So that's where we stand right now. We can't get in the mainstream media, but we have the goods on all this stuff. And so just to sum up here, with respect to those emails to the Democratic National Committee, were they real? Of course they were real. Did they damage Hillary Clinton? I imagine so. What's the Russian connection? Well, Obama told us 2 days before he left. It's inconclusive. Now, if you can't prove that WikiLeaks got them from the Russians. You don't have a case, all right? And we can prove from the other point of view that if the Russians hacked, NSA would ipso facto have that hack. They would have that email. They collect everything. Now, when I said to I said, Bill, come on, everything, like, come on, all emails and all stuff. He says, Ray, you liberal arts people really kind of get me. He says, look, you got to trust me on this. I constructed the system, and when Ed Snowden came out at the Hong Kong, he showed slides. He showed these things where the trace mechanisms built in to the internet, they trace each email from origin to finish. The packets that are dissolved at one point come back together at the finish. We know that NSA has them all, and if they had the goods on Russia, they would certainly produce those. So it's back to square one in a very real sense. But the people in this country are impoverished on knowledge about what we've learned and how it should be the case that if you can't prove a link to WikiLeaks from Russia, you ain't got a case, and we have to just keep plugging away as we do.
Well, Bob Perry, the founder of Consortium News, he wrote about the emails because that happened while Bob was still alive, and he said at least one time, I know, and I completely agree with this, as I did with most of what Bob said, that it didn't matter who the source was, as long as those emails and documents are true. Now, when you're reporting a story and you're getting only verbal information from a source, you certainly do have to check out their motives, who they are. It's a lot harder to prove whether they're telling you the truth or not. But when documents are delivered to you, you sometimes don't even know who gave them to you. So you might go along with it and find that they're absolutely verified and true. Do you stop publishing because you found out that a Russian government gave them to you? Was the origin of these, if they were, let's say, and they gave them to WikiLeaks, and that's why we have them? No. If they're true, you're going to go with it. Even Alan Russ Bridger, the former Guardian editor, who worked very closely with Julian Assange during the publications of some of these early WikiLeaks leaks, was at an event at the National Press Club. I've mentioned this before. And he was up there on the stage, and he was being interviewed by Marty Barron, the top editor at the Washington Post. And Barron was asking him, would you have, if you knew this was from Russia at the time, would you have, if any of that, would you have published it? And first he said no, and then he said maybe, and then he basically at the end he said, well, yes, I would. And everyone laughed. So there you go. Even Russ Bridger would say, well, if we get some really damn good story, who cares who the source is if it's true? And in the case of documents, it's easy to prove it's true. It's much harder when you just hear in somebody's story to vet it and find out if it's true or not. But let me ask you about Giuliani, because what do you make of what he said? Do you agree with Margaret that this was really not that important because he's not a member of the government and he doesn't, and Trump won't listen to him, or was it significant?
Well, I always agree with Margaret.
Oh. Okay, that's easy. Next question.
No, I didn't have the privilege of living in New York City under Giuliani, but I share the views that you just expressed. He's a weak read. Even if he's talked to Obama, my God, even if he's talked to Trump about this, okay? Even if he kind of said, I'm going to say this, is this okay? I mean, there's no reason to believe that Trump wouldn't change his mind tomorrow or the next day and change it back. So what I'm interested mostly in is this Ecuadorian IMF thing.
Yeah.
I'm interested in knowing how it was that some people got in to see Julian just about 10 days or 2 weeks ago. Is he still incommunicado? Can he use his computer? What about his friends? Are his friends still out of jail or out of prison? In other words, can WikiLeaks still operate? Can they still receive things and publish them as they continue to do right up until, the real damaging stuff came in March of last year. Not last year now, but March of 2017, with the treasure trove of authentic CIA documents showing the offensive cyber warfare tools that CIA and NSA developed together, one of which, get this now, one of which, called Marble, allows an entity like the CIA to hack into a computer or a server, disguise who it was that hacked in, and leave little breadcrumbs, electronic breadcrumbs, little things in languages like Russian, like Cyrillic, that will show, okay, that it was the Russians that hacked in. Now, um, we know that that tool was used in 2016. We know that tool can handle 5 languages: Chinese, Korean, Persian, Arabic, and Russian. So, if you have the motive, if you have the incentive, as the CIA would have, we know how John Brennan feels about Trump, and we know he did everything he could to help Hillary win. If you have the incentive and you have the capability, which is in these CIA documents, it's not a stretch to the imagination to say, maybe it wasn't the Russians. Maybe it was somebody who was trying to, the CIA word used was obfuscate, trying to obfuscate who hacked in. Now, I caution you, Bill Binney, Ed Loomis, the rest of the technical people, and I, and veteran intelligence professionals for sanity, have physical evidence about the hacking, okay? Now, this is not physical evidence. This is sort of all source kind of analysis, the kind of stuff I did. You have to read all the press and even memoirs of people like James Clapper. So you put it all together and you say, well, wait a second now. If it wasn't the Russians, who could possibly have done that? Well, here's a tool that actually does this. And here it is, CIA documents saying, whoa, this can be done. And the proof is in the pudding. Joe, you mentioned that CIA Director Pompeo got up before a think tank and pompously said, WikiLeaks, Julian Assange is a demon. Now, on the side here, I've never had much truck with demons. I don't really buy demons, but Pompeo does, okay? So he's a demon, and his associates are a demon, and they're a non-state hostile intelligence agency. Whoa. When did Pompeo say that? He said that 13 days after Marble was released, was to show that that CIA had this capability to do this kind of thing, and the 35-cent CIA word, obfuscate who did it. That's big, okay? And he didn't want that to happen. And that's, that was the same period of time, late March last year, when they cut off Julian's communications with the rest of the world and decided to really lean very hard on this little country, where they were able to turn Correa's successor into a vassal and to get him the help he needs so he would turn Julian around. So if Giuliani, that's a good sign. Okay, there are other good signs that have happened recently, but Julian still languishes there. Last time I saw him was 3 days before the US election in November 2016. He always looks he's got this pallor, what makes it seem that he's been inside for 5 years, which was the case, okay? Now it's going on 7 years. And he looked like hell, but he looked really happy. And I said, why are you so happy? He said, well, I did what I need to do. I published and I defended my publishing. And now let's have this beer. And I said, okay, we'll do that. And what had happened that day? Well, he had an interview by John Pilger. And John Pilger asked him all the outstanding questions that Julian wanted to get out into the air, okay? And Pilger had taken that to the BBC. And the BBC said, oh, no, we don't. And Channel 4 in London said, no, no. He went to all the obvious places, and they said, no, Julian Assange, no. So he had to go to RT to get it out in the air. So Julian said to me, I know John is the best guy to do this. If he couldn't sell it, anyway, if he couldn't pay people to put it out there in the ether, well, that was because it's just impossible. So RT carried it. It was over as far as Julian. There was not a trace of I'm going to get Hillary or there's no trace of that. There was a big trace of, look, I did my job. It's exhausting. It was really, really hard. But when people leak these things to me, what am I going to do? Am I going to sit on them? If they leaked from the Republican National Committee, would I sit on them? Come on, So Julian is a friend of mine, and I'm proud of that. Okay, and I'm going to defend him against these trumped-up charges, no pun intended, as long as I can, and as long as people will listen. The trouble is, very few people have a chance to listen.
Well, Vivian Kubrick has joined us. She looks like she's been out in the sun in Florida for a long time. Not
well,
up in an embassy, but I wanted to go to Margaret first with Vivian. Do you mind?
No. You've got to let me cut in because I've been going.
Okay. All right. I guess I have no choice.
Okay. I totally disagree with Margaret and Ray about Giuliani's impact on Trump.
Okay.
I can say, if I don't sound too absurd, describing that I have some knowledge of powerful men and how they are most influenced. And most powerful men are used to having a lot of people give them a lot of flack. And so in my experience, they tend to choose certain real allies on a personal level, like somebody that is a friend that they trust. And Ray, I'm sure that you know this yourself, that within the CIA, you probably had a few choice people that you really trusted, so that if the rest of the CIA was, sort of pushing something, you would talk to your friend and you would both have this very strong feeling of what was the right thing to do. And I think that Trump, given the incredible animosity, outrageous, in fact, that's not even the right word, the vehement hatred shown towards him by the mainstream media and the people around him, I would have thought the number one people that he's going to spend time listening to are his actual close friends. Now, I also know that powerful men, they choose attorneys that they're friends with. And usually the closest person to them is their attorney in the sense of who is their confidant. And so I was texting Susie saying, let me get on here. I want to say something. Because I really think that Giuliani and Trump are friends, and that he chose him to be his attorney means a lot. You don't just choose an attorney as President Trump lightly. This is someone that you trust implicitly, that you have a lot of shared values. So my viewpoint, and that's when I saw it, I tweeted out a million times how excited I was, because I believe that Giuliani, the fact that he came out on the TV, believe me, Trump and him would have talked about that. Giuliani can't afford to waltz out into the mainstream media and just say what he thinks as Trump's attorney. He's like Trump's sort of private right-hand man. There's no way that he would have said that without Trump going, yeah, go out there and say that. So anyway, I just wanted to butt in and say that. Now you can go back, and I will go to I will go to my rightful time, which is after you. So after you two lovely people who I don't agree with. So I'm gonna come back when you guys are finished. Anyway, I just had to say that.
Well, I'm glad you did, Vivian, because another person who was very excited about that news of Giuliani was Daniel Ellsberg.
Hello.
I was at a New Year's Eve party in Washington, D.C., and Dan called in and he sent the article I'd written to one of the guests there. And then I heard across the room, hey, Joe, did you hear what Giuliani said? Well, I said, I wrote the story, so I guess I... So, and he was going on and on about that. He was over the top. He sent an email to to people to Susie and the other people at Unity for Jay about how important he thought that was, because obviously he knows the Pentagon Papers issue, that's his issue. For Giuliani to bring that up and compare WikiLeaks publication to the Pentagon Papers was something that Dan was excited about and thought. And you make good points here. Well, of course, they are friends, apparently, going back to New York when Rudy was mayor and Trump was on the front page of the tabloids every day and being this man about town and whatnot. And so they certainly know each other many, many years. Of course, we don't know what this is going to lead to. And Ray is also right about one thing, at least, that Trump says one thing one day and the next day it's the opposite. So you can't really.
But I just want to say.
But if Giuliani's in his face, I don't understand. Go on. Yeah.
Sorry, I mean, this is one thing that I can contribute, which, I'm sure all of you know powerful people, but I sat there from a childhood listening to the heads of film studios and lawyers and my father, and I know how they conduct business, and they're pretty immune. They're really immune to what most people think. They kind of do what they want to do, and they confide at about similar levels of power to each other. And I feel that we should be really, really excited that Giuliani came out and said that, because that, first of all, it took balls to say that, because I mean, you could see, I mean, it made me laugh when the presenter just sort of cut him off and said, "So, what do you think about the Mets?" And it was just like, cut this motherfucker from speaking. And so I think that also is a clue to how important what he said was. So I am still very excited that he said that. And I think that you guys should be excited about it, because those are where the big decisions are made in terms of how powerful men work. They don't, and Trump has an executive, I mean, I don't know whether he can actually, well, yeah, he can. He can give a president's pardon, like Obama did with Bradley Manning, Chelsea. And so I'm very hopeful, and I think everyone should be hopeful, because it shows something has shifted that Giuliani said that. I mean, Trump would hang him up by his balls if he just, went out into the public arena. He's his attorney. He's his representative in the world. So anyway, I've banged on enough about this, and I shall now release you all back to your conversation.
Gee, I like that kind of talk. So,
I would.
Margaret, you want to defend yourself?
Sure, I'm happy to be wrong. I'll just say that much. I'm delighted to be incorrect in this case.
So would I.
That's happy for me to be wrong. Yes. The problem with Trump, trying to figure out anything about Trump, he's so inconsistent and he's an impulsive person. So it's difficult to say what he will do. Just a couple weeks ago, he says he's going to pull troops out of Syria. Then they get to him, and now he's like, well, not so many, not so fast. So you never know. You never know with him. It's so hard to figure out what he will or won't do. Also,
sorry, Margaret, I'm being so rude. Forgive me. It's just that that's one of the sort of standard ploys 101 of someone who's a businessman, is to be unpredictable, because the worst thing you can be negotiating is to be completely predictable. People have to sweat it out and worry about what the decision is that you're going to make. And I know I'm sounding like I know everything, but I really, what I'm trying to do is instill hope and not make people think that this isn't significant, because I really believe it is significant. And I think that, that's why I've been also texting to Giuliani, all kinds of things. I'm sure he gets a million texts. I'm all praying that Giuliani and Trump are big Kubrick fans, and that maybe if they just,
well, who knows? But so yes, that could be true. But Trump can seemingly make his unpredictability is a problem. It's a problem in many ways. He says one thing, does another. So you don't know. He finally did go to North Korea, but as I recall, first he said he wasn't going, then he said he was, then he wouldn't, then he went, then he backtracked.
Yeah, but Margaret, that is.
I'd like to sort of go on to something else here too. Another thing that has changed, I think it's significant, Daniel Ellsberg's opinion, but things have worsened since Ellsberg's time. We talked about Obama, and Obama criminalized leaking. Since Obama used the Espionage Act more than any other, was it more than any other president combined? Is that,
Yes.
am I correct?
Yes, that's correct. That's correct.
So he started treating leakers like criminals. And that has unfortunately become, that precedent, I think, is still out there. As I said before, we don't know what Trump is going to do. But it's much tougher now for leakers. They go to jail. They send people to jail for leaking. Poor little reality winner is in jail for leaking something that was nonsense. So that was of no value whatsoever. So it's difficult to say. I do want to be hopeful. I'm part of this process because I'm hoping to be a part of the discussion at least. But my big worry is the Ecuadorian government, frankly. And I know a couple of weeks ago we had the gentleman on from Ecuador explaining some of the intricacies of Ecuadorian politics right now, and what this new government is doing. And I was particularly disturbed when I read about this audit of their conducting of Julian's the asylum and granting him citizenships. They're trying to weasel out of it. Correa gave him protection, and they're trying to take it away. So I'm hoping that, I know Julian has great attorneys, and I'm sure they're thinking about this much more than I am. But I hope they have plans in place for that day that the Ecuadorians say he's no longer welcome, and that he has to leave. And I've also wondered, I don't know if anybody can add anything to this, I always suspected Julian had a doomsday trap of some sort. The day I'm arrested, this is what has to come out. And I don't want to find that out, because that would mean that the worst thing has happened. But I think even if they do expel him, I don't think the story will be over, although it remains to be seen if he can do what he could do to help himself at that.
Hey, I don't know if any of you can see it, but Ray's been waving his hand around. He wants to say something.
Thank you, Vivian. And I hope you're right. Like Margaret, we have to keep an upbeat kind of tone here. However, everything you said assumes that Trump is his own man.
It's true too.
And he's not.
You don't think that he could pardon?
No, the CIA has big stakes in this. I think Julian has just released the icing from a very deep cake that he has. The CIA is out to get him, and they will get him if they can. Now, do they do things that Trump doesn't approve of? Yeah, they do, actually. they do that with Obama as well. Is the political climate such, with US people being so brainwashed about the terrible things that Julian has done? Is it such that Trump could do this as a popular move? I don't think so. And so, here's one very high official who said that Julian Assange is a high-tech terrorist. Now, I could dismiss that if it were, somebody in the media, but this happened to be the Vice President of the United States. His name is Joe Biden, and I almost got sick this week when it appeared likely that he would be in the running to be our next president. So that's the mood. I applaud your optimism. I just think that has to be soaked in a great big rag of realism. And we need to go into this with our eyes open. Sure, it's a good sign. Unpredictability is one thing, whether Trump is his own man is quite another and a more important thing, in my view. Who knows?
Well, no, I appreciate absolutely what you've said. I mean, clearly, the globalist movement is well embedded into all of the intelligence services. I mean, presumably that's why the intelligence services are no longer actually performing their proper duties. Would you agree, or do you think I'm in my ignorance saying inaccurate things?
Well, no, Vivian, I think you hit the nail on the head, as you usually do. Now, take, for example, what was the CIA doing for the last couple of years? They were guiding drones, killer drones, and they were looking for evidence of Russian collusion with Trump. What happened in the meantime? The Russians developed a whole new genre of strategic weaponry that renders many of our defenses obsolete, renders our 11 aircraft carriers a joke, okay? Now, did that come as a big surprise? Well, everything speaking to me suggests, yeah, on the 1st of March, this past year, Putin announced the creation of these things, some of which are now actually deployed. And what was the CIA doing? Well, I think we know what they were doing. They were trying to figure out what source in Beirut said that maybe this cell phone matched up with a terrorist in Afghanistan. Oh, wasn't that neat? Instead of doing their job, looking at the balance of power here, looking at what the Russians might be doing as a reaction to our own emplacement of in Europe.
Actually, this is something where I am completely ignorant of it, but I'm just going to go for it anyway. Clearly, it is the job of the head of the CIA, presumably, to create an actual objective for what you're supposed to be watching, right? Because like you said, the big problem with the NSA and all of these intelligence services is that they're gathering absolutely impossible amounts that cannot be reviewed. Like Binney said about how absurd and impossible they're giving the job they're giving themselves. I mean, that's presuming that that's really, just innocent overwhelm on their part. But what I'm really interested in is why doesn't, for instance, the head of the CIA come to Trump and say, Russia, we are concerned that should they invent a bunch of weapons that will completely outperform blah, 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 what are we going to do? Now, obviously, that's, I'm going to give analogies for film. When you're in production on a film, the assistant director has to watch what's coming over the horizon so that you can properly plan your schedule, because otherwise you're going to lose, hundreds of millions of dollars, if you get all your schedule screwed up when you're filming. And in a way, you need an assistant director in the CIA who actually is watching what's coming over the horizon and sets his particular staff, like one watching all the military, possible military testing, or if you've got spies in Russia, that they're watching, military companies that are inventing or they're stealing designs from the Russians of their latest weapons. I mean, I thought that's what intelligence services are supposed to be doing. So when you said they're not watching the right things, then you have to wonder, who the hell is the director of the CIA and who does he really work for?
Well, that's easy. The director of the CIA now is the woman that ran the first torture salon.
I know. Bloody Gina.
What does she know about Russia? What does the assistant to her know about Russia? In other words, I hate to say this, but what you describe is the way it was for most of my tenure of 27 years there. That's what we should have been doing, and we did it for the most part. Now, I'm not at all sure that a career path toward looking at Russia and trying to figure out how the Russians look at things is a way to succeed. The way to succeed is to become a targeteer, to have a little group that gets little informations from here and there and make sure they give them to the drone targeteers in this country. And in 3 seconds, that suspected terrorist is vaporized. Okay, that's how you get ahead in the CIA now, as far as I can tell. And so if that's the emphasis, what's the point in trying to do substantive work in an honest way. So that's one of my problems here. When Bill Binney, who you mentioned before, one of our veteran intelligence professionals for sanity, when we were invited to see the head of the CIA, Pompeo, at the direction of the president, Trump, okay? We walked in to see Pompeo. They had an hour together. First thing that Pompeo said was, well, what do you have to say? And Bill, Bill is a very plain-spoken person, as you know. And he said, well, you need to know, sir, that your people are lying to you. You know? And so Pompeo said, what do you mean? What do you mean? And so Bill took him through the whole business about the Russian hacking and all that, and WikiLeaks and all that stuff. And then Pompeo says, well, gosh, do you know the FBI? Do you know somebody in the FBI? And Bill says, well, I know four people. Oh, well, it's not what you think. 4 of them raided my home 6 years ago.
This is like the Keystone Cops or something.
Put guns at the heads of my wife and my son. And so those are the ones they took all our, we still don't have our computers back. So I guess I have to admit, yeah, I know those 4 guys from there, but is that what you mean? So Pompeo ended up saying, well, see the big shots in FBI. See the guys in NSA, talk to them. They talk to you? Do you know them? He says, I know them chapter and verse. They're going to talk to me forever. So there's a certain, I mean, it's not naivete. It's just pure ignorance on the part of this guy who was the CIA director. Now he's just Secretary of State, for God's sake. You know, Pompeo, well, you know, I can understand maybe if Trump did study some Shakespeare, maybe he said to somebody one day, get around me men that are fat. Young Bolton has a mean and angry. That's so. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no. I tell you what you're making me think of while you're talking is that really this is the potential of WikiLeaks, is that for people within the industry, in the military industry, both in Russia and everywhere else in the world, that would actually like to take an active role in bringing peace to this world, they would send copies of military designs for missiles and everything else to WikiLeaks, and WikiLeaks can then give it to the Americans so that they're constantly actually being helped to stay, because it's the balance of power that creates all this danger. So, I could really materially, I mean, I hope I'm not going to get shot in the head for suggesting this, but I think that if ordinary individuals set themselves up as moles in these big military, industries, stole copies of their latest weapons and gave it to WikiLeaks to give to America and vice versa, or whatever, that individual human beings could keep the balance of power, because that's when it gets very dangerous, is that America has been a 500-pound gorilla for a long time.
That's right.
Sorry.
Yeah. If I could interject here, the proof is in the pudding. Colleen Rowley, who is one of our group, she was an FBI lawyer and an FBI special agent before 9/11. And she writes about how they had the evidence. They had Moussaoui, one of the hijackers, and they were deprived of the ability to look into his computer. Had FBI headquarters said, look into said it's okay, well, they could have surfaced that thing and the whole plot would have been short-circuited. Now, we asked, or the press asked really, Colleen Rowley and this fellow Bogdan Zakovich. Now, Bogdan was head of a red team that worked for the Federal Aviation Administration. And their job was to see if they could penetrate airports, penetrate aircraft, have a fake bomb, get onto the aircraft. And guess what? Before 9/11, they succeeded in 8 out of 10 cases. Just took a little imagination. So what am I saying? I'm saying that when the Los Angeles Times asked Zakovich and Rowley, Colleen Rowley, Suppose WikiLeaks was in operation at that point. You guys were really frustrated. You couldn't get FBI headquarters to allow you to do your job. You got no sympathy from the people you work for, the Federal Aviation Administration. Would you? This is the big question. Would you have gone to WikiLeaks? Guess what the answer?
Exactly.
Yes,
exactly.
they would. Yes, they
Yay!
would.
You see
Okay,
that's
that's why
why
they hate him
wanted-
so much. Yeah,
That's right. Sorry, I'm getting all excited. You're so
Okay.
right. And that's why WikiLeaks is so dangerous and Julian. But the principle that we're talking about is, I think, the crux of what needs to be more explored within independent media is to talk about the actual structure of well, not structure, the actual way in which the things that are out of our immediate control, or indeed out of our control completely, can be controlled by us, because, you know, they think that they want to replace humanity with these, you know, bloody AI things, and, you know, kill all of us with, you know, toxic food and everything else they're trying to do. You know, that in the end, they actually need people. They need people to man their computers and, you know, whatever the, you know, people do for them. And in the end, that's their delusional power. Their delusional sense of power is reliant on keeping everyone dumb and powerless. But WikiLeaks is the ultimate tool for humanity. It's the ultimate tool for every single person in every department of the US government, the Russian government, anywhere across the world, to go ahead. Sorry, I'm choking now. I'm getting overexcited. Hey, check this out. And then the second they put that out and publish it, that's the end of that, you know, power grab by a particular group. Okay. I'm watching, by the way, I'm watching in groups, so I can see people going like this. So.
Yeah,
Anyway.
Just another word for me, and then I'll stop. There are always one or two courageous people with a conscience in any government outfit. That's why, for example, Julian Assange was given these leaks, the leaks from the Democratic National Committee that showed that Hillary had stolen the nomination from Bernie Sanders. That's why some fellow in the CIA gave the Vault 7 documents that show that the CIA can hack into computer systems and obfuscate who hacked in. So there are always those people. And thank goodness, because I think those people, maybe two of them still, are in the Justice Department of our country. And that's why Bob Mueller, even if he wanted to manufacture some evidence to show that WikiLeaks was in cahoots, that WikiLeaks actually actively sought all this stuff, and they could try him on the Espionage Act that way. Even if he manufactured evidence, as they did before Iraq, weapons of mass destruction, okay, even if they tried to do that, it would be too risky, because Mueller knows that out of his 18,000 lawyers, there are probably 2 or 3 still around who would go to WikiLeaks. That's why they hate him. And I would just, a little footnote here, please get a hold of the Los Angeles Times op-ed that Colleen Rowley and Bogdan Zakovich wrote about 5 years ago now, but it's very telling about how useful it is to have some place to go, some way to do it, and that's why they're out to get Julian.
All right, sorry, I'm terrible. Go on, Joe.
I was just going to say that used to be the press. That was where Kevin goes. Please go on, Vivian.
Well, you know what occurs to me is, like in the very early days when I got a communication from WikiLeaks saying, please go on our site and download all these documents, because we want to protect the fact that we might have these documents taken off our site or, you know, grabbed by the authorities. And I sort of busily tried to download these things in a completely tragic fashion, because I had no idea how to use Tor or anything else. But it seems to me that what would be an incredibly powerful move is for maybe 4,000 hackers across the world to create mirror sites like WikiLeaks, so that it's not just WikiLeaks that gets the drop. In other words, WikiLeaks would actually still filter everything, but the drop-off boxes would be all over the planet. So that, one of the reasons why WikiLeaks is vulnerable is because of the people, sorry, I'm not finishing my ideas. One of the reasons why WikiLeaks is vulnerable is if there's a certain number of people that if they knock them out, that's the end of WikiLeaks. So obviously the thing to do is to create a global, I don't know, on the dark net. I mean, clearly the CIA like the dark net so they can go creeping around. So on the dark net, create these vast receptacles and just, hold power to, what's the expression? Oh, bloody hell, someone finish that expression for me. Hold power to justice. What's the expression?
Truth to power. Speak truth to power.
Well, basically say to power, you know what, you can't pull this shit because there's 4,000 places now that hold these documents. So if you can find all of them in the next week, good luck. But in the meantime, we're going to be giving these out to the press that are going to be revitalized by having the capacity to write real news that people will really want to read. Sorry, I am like in a passionate state and I'm going to actually discipline myself to shut up now. So please.
Well, I'm thinking about what Joe just said about what the press used to do and used to be. This story broke recently about this integrity initiative in the UK, and the press have covered it up. This intelligence cutout has been working to smear Jeremy Corbyn, a man who could be the prime minister one day. They have interfered in the affairs of other European nations. There's a man connected with the organization who apparently was spying on Bernie Sanders' campaign, an Englishman who just turned up in Iowa, and now he has links with this organization. And the BBC and the Guardian and the New York Times have said nothing about the integrity initiative. And it's the sort of thing that, and that we have hackers to thank, the anonymous, I believe they are hackers, I believe it's plural. They are the ones who thankfully broke this story, but unless you know the right people to follow on social media, you don't know that it happened. And it's a huge story. It should be a huge story. So we do need a good press. We do need an active media. But see, let's look what they've done with Julian, what they've done with the so-called Russiagate story. They repeat and repeat and repeat over and over again the same thing. They do not allow a counter narrative. Even The Nation, as Ray was telling us, took heat for once just to give a different view of this story. So it's the press are problematic these days. They really are. They are more the agents of governments, and I'd like to think that if this were to happen, if they had material from WikiLeaks, I'm not sure that we'd see it. I'm that cynical, with good reason, about what they do.
Well, I can. Sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I mean, while you were talking, I was thinking about, the untold numbers of men and women that understand enough how to protect, like Edward Snowden, I'm sure, would have the knowledge to protect a site that would operate similar to Drudge, where you could except you would have to do it anonymously, that journalists of high stature would be able to publish anonymously the stories they really want to tell, because I'm sure that there's a lot of terrific journalists that must feel like putting a bullet in their head for the lack of their ability to really write what they want to write. And maybe you sort of set up a WikiLeaks press where you anonymously publish stories on the WikiLeaks documents that aren't getting talked about.
Well, that's consortium news, because Bob Perry started the word consortium, and that means it's supposed to be a consortium of reporters who were getting their stories spiked by their editors that were important stories, as happened to Bob when he broke many stories on Iran-Contra that they did not want to publish, including the name of Oliver North's involvement. We all know Oliver North. That only got published because the AP Spanish desk mistakenly translated it and published it. So then the English, the desk had to, well, they had to put it out too, didn't they? And that's how America became, how Oliver North became known to the United States. So Consortium News would certainly be a place anybody out there who wants to, we would publish that if need be anonymously. We would just say from a correspondent. And we will publish anything that people can't get out. We're trying to do that. It's hard to reach out and make that known, but that's a great idea, Vivian.
Yeah, sorry, that's really what and that's why is it consortium or consortium? Because Ron Paul calls it consortium.
Both are correct. Both are correct.
Okay, all right, I'm going to say consortium. The thing that I was just meaning is that if WikiLeaks had a sister site called WikiLeaks Press, of which any language, any person can anonymously deliver an article based on the documents that WikiLeaks has there for people to download, so that it can become much more of a publishing operation, right? Because obviously, I mean, I realized that people would have to be vetted. You'd have to have WikiLeaks know who these people are, which of course then makes WikiLeaks a huge target. But I'm just trying to invent. I mean, if anybody out there listening or anyone on Discord has any ingenious ways of creating lots of mirror sister sites, I mean, not that you'd print that because you wouldn't want that to be known, but where people can figure out a way of designing a really impossible network that cannot be taken down, a little bit, I don't know. I'd have to study some Second World War espionage things because there's so many extraordinary ways in which they got around things and got information around. But anyway, right.
Well, there are some glimmers of hope. William Arkin, who is one of the best writers and reporters in our capital, used to work for NBC, and he got fed up to here. And he resigned. And not only did he resign, but he sent an email out to various and sundry, which is on our website, on my website, raymcgovern.com. And that email indicates why he quit. We also have the strange, this is really strange, the previous executive editor of the New York Times, Jill Abramson, has written a book.
Yes, I saw that. I saw that she's written up.
And of all people, she's saying the coverage is biased. The coverage is terrible. The New York Times is terribly biased. Okay, well, it's worse than biased. The New York Times is bought and sold by the government, and who knows that better than Jill Abramson? He was the head of the Washington bureau of the New York Times when Judith Miller and David Sanger and all these people were taking Kool-Aid from the National Security Council and from the White House, from the Defense Department about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Okay, she was in charge of that. She was also in charge of that office when James Risen, one of her writers, uncovered the fact that the Fourth Amendment had gone into abeyance, that under Cheney and Bush, everything, all our telephone conversations, everything without a warrant was being collected. Now, when James Risen found that out, that was June or July 2004, an election year. Now, he wanted to sell the story, but the high muckety-mucks at the New York Times said, oh, no, you can't do that. It's too close to the election. June, July, August, September, October. Too close to the election? They sat on it. They sat on it for a year and 3 months. Okay. Finally, James Risen, who, by the way, could have leaked that. There are ways to do that. He held off because he was writing a book. And in December of the following year, so in December of 2005, James Risen said, my book is in galley. I better tell my superiors at the New York Times because they're going to look very, very funny if my book comes out and the New York Times hasn't said word one about this dragnet coverage, this intercept of all our communication. So he goes to Jill Abramson and her uppers and say, well, I'm going to put this book out, so you might want to do a story now. After all, you put it off in 2004, and Bush won. So maybe, and well, what happens? Sulzberger, the head of the New York Times, is ordered down to the Oval Office, and Bush says, "No, you can't do this. We can't. You can't. We'll endanger social, national security, national security." And Sulzberger says, oh, "Come on, George. We put it off for what, 16 months? It's too embarrassing. We can't have one of our writers do a book." And so Bush said, "Oh, I'm against it." Well, they left, and then 12 days later, New York Times has this article by Reisen and Lichtblau showing what all happened. Okay, now what's my point there? My point there is that Gil Abramson, who's now written a book about how the New York Times is too kind of biased against Trump. And well, that's true enough, but wow, when was her come to Jesus moment? The bottom line here is this, that there are certain people in our society that know what's good for America. They populate the top levels of all the media. And I mean all the media, all the mainstream media. And let me just repeat one vignette that I think speaks volumes. Bob Perry. He's got Iran-Contra. He's unveiled the fact that Oliver North is running his own intelligence operation for the Contras. The Contras are selling drugs in Los Angeles. He's got the whole schmear, okay? He becomes a star. And just instead of working for AP, he's offered a job with Newsweek in Washington. So he's made it, right? So the head of Newsweek says, "Hey, Bob, we have corporate coming down from New York on Saturday. We're going to have a little dinner party, and we'd like you to come along." And Bob told me, I said, "Well, sure, you know." So it was 12 people, like the 12 apostles. They're all men, like the 12 apostles. And they were all big muckety mucks. One was a representative from Wyoming. His name was Sweeney, actually. And there was a fellow from who had just stopped being Ronald Reagan's national security advisor. That was a fellow named Brent Scowcroft. Now, here's the story. Bob is eating his shrimp cocktail, which he told me was quite good, okay? When Scowcroft, out of the blue, says, "Now, my deputy, Admiral Poindexter, has to go testify at Congress next Tuesday, and I would advise him strongly to tell Congress that we never said one word to the president about this." Now, Bob, he's got his fork here. He drops his fork into the shrimp cocktail dish, almost shatters it, and without thinking says, "General Scowcroft, do I understand that you would encourage your former deputy to perjure himself before Congress?" That's how quiet it was for about 30 seconds, okay? Nobody said anything. And then the head of Newsweek put his arm around Bob, and he said, "Now, Bob, sometimes you have to do what's best for the country." Whoa. Gentlemanly laughter all around, okay? Now, what does that mean? They know what's best for the country. If they're going to sit on gross violations of the Fourth Amendment, they will, because they know what's best for the country. And not only that, but they give the government pre-censorship rights. So when Vault 7, with the cyber tools, when that was released by WikiLeaks on the 31st of March, 2017, they revealed this tool that could have done what they accuse the Russians of doing, okay? What happened? The New York Times trotted off to, well, maybe they just called them on the phone and said, "My God, well, what about this?" They said, don't publish. And that tool was kept out of the New York Times. Now, supreme irony, there was a woman, a pretty enterprising woman on the Washington Post. Her name is Ellen Nakashima. She didn't get the memo on time. She saw what a terrific story this was. Headline, WikiLeaks exposes a CIA cover operation for intercepting or for hacking into system. So the story got out, but not in the New York Times. So that's that's kind of a bunch of commentary on how disingenuous the media is, but also on how they know what's best for us. and are willing to go to all kinds of Machiavellian ends to make sure that we only learn what we need to know.
Well, I want to just ask you a couple of questions. Do you believe that corruption is such a impossible thing to rid ourselves of as a civilization that we will never manage to create a system like Frank Serpico? You know, he is still, you know, I was, or not really, I don't know, did he die? I can't remember. But he's still alive. You know, he has tried since the early 70s to bring about an actual independent, group of men and women to oversee police corruption. And really, if you think about it, politics is no different than the police force, because they have the same access and the same abilities to just disregard the law. So, you know, I mean, I know obviously the populations of the world that aren't in politics and also aren't police officers can be just as wonderfully corrupt. But do you think here's a question. Do you think the CIA or any actual analytical department of the US government bothers to try and think about how they can rid themselves of corruption? Because I would have thought that's, you know, an intelligence service job 101.
Well, that should be the case, Vivian. My problem is that we have to be kind of going into this with our eyes open, knowing that we're going to lose. Now, I like to quote I.F. Stone, who famously said, we have to realize that we're going to lose, and then we're going to lose, and then we're going to lose and lose. But one day, someone who thinks the way we do, someone who has uppermost in his or her mind integrity and honesty, they're going to win. Okay? Now, be prepared for that, be able to work for that, but don't really expect to see that in your own lifetime. So that's my attitude here. We do what we do because it's good. The success, you know, may escape us. Success, what I like to do is I like to quote Victor Hugo in Les Miserables, okay? The bishop, the good bishop that said he gave the candlestick holders to Jean Valjean. He was described as he's never going to be an archbishop or a cardinal. Okay? Why? Because they can't even get priests to work in his diocese. You know, he's just. Then Hugo says, you know, this is a teaching point, says Hugo. He says, you know, all too often, success get mixed up with honesty. And the two don't go together always. And so Bishop Bienvenu was fixated on honesty and building integrity. And success was a dubious word for him. He wasn't looking for success, as Dan Berrigan used to put it. The good is worth doing because it's good. And we have to escape this American mindset that you don't attempt anything unless you have a reasonable expectation of success. You do it anyway. That's my philosophy, for what it's worth.
Well, I think it's a very good philosophy. I would add to it a few more descriptors, which is what is the difference between the good and the great? And I think people, particularly in America, because of this very competitive, fundamental characteristic of American values, is this idea that if you're great, you must be great. And in fact, we all know that most people that, you know, scramble up to the top of the heap have done so treading on everyone else's heads. And so I feel that people need to adjust their reality, which is why it frustrates me so completely that people have this idea that Julian's just this nasty little tool of the Russians. He is a great man. He is a man who has, you know, stepped up to the plate, like, with everything in his heart, in his intellectual prowess as someone who's philosophical and is driven by integrity. And yet, amazingly, people seem immune to the facts. These are not just my opinions. Obviously, a man who's risked everything to bring people the truth, of which 100% of their documentation has been validated as real and true, right? I can't think of a single newspaper in the universe, forget planet Earth, that has that record. And so, I'm sorry to be squawking. I'm going to have to talk more like you, Ray. Okay. So I think that people should acknowledge that Julian has done something good, and good turns out to be better than great, because great is what the problem is around this planet. Great, big, and if I may be simplistic about this, nutters, lunatics, psychopaths that seem to be groomed to take over positions of power. And somehow, we've got to figure out how to reorganize society. And certainly, people get all upset, like you were saying, that we keep losing. But maybe that's because nobody realizes that we've got all this knowledge, right? But the other side, the flip side of knowledge, is the creation of knowledge. So if we work out how to, for instance, I don't mean to be idiotic and say that I've thought of the greatest thing in the world, but clearly making mirror sites of WikiLeaks, making a WikiLeaks press, of which I can well imagine that there are a gazillion, technicians, both within the Secret Service, who would be able to anonymously, help set that up. I mean, really, in the end, I don't know how many of you read spy stories, but, spy stories consist of people who pretend to be one thing and are doing something else. Well, I would have thought the people in the CIA and the NSA who went into that with, real values in their heart, only to be, dashed upon working there long enough to find out what's really going on. Why don't they just generate their own network of, Secret Service men, like, veterans for sanity, and just go in there and help people like WikiLeaks, or indeed, how about generate their own WikiLeaks? I mean, I would have thought the prime, subjects, the people that would most easily be able to create a WikiLeaks would be the actual Secret Service men themselves. I mean, am I talking wild, crazed nonsense, or does this have any bearing on reality? I'm curious what you both think.
Well, I would say, Vivian, I would say that creativity is the key word here. And I think that the technology is such that as it develops and grows further, that it will be possible for citizens to become educated, to become aware of what's going on in a way that is not possible now, unless you know where to look in the alternative media, unless you read consortiumnews.com, okay? So I expect actually, that people like Julian, who are talented, well-motivated, have integrity that won't quit, will come up with some kind of a system where people gradually begin to know, look, all I have to do is touch this key on my computer and I get the real deal. I get the real news. Until that happens, we have to just keep struggling the ways we have been. And I think if someone wants to give something to WikiLeaks now, they still can. Am I wrong in that? Is that vorbei, as the Germans say?
Oh, sorry. You know what? I just am looking at the chat. Kathy Vogan just said, can someone tell Vivian WikiLeaks is mirrored all around the world since Amazon bumped them off their servers in 2010? So, sorry. They don't make the messaging big enough. I've been trying to catch what it says there, but it's like a micro writing. I probably need, well, but what I'm asking you though is, in your experience, having been in the CIA, sorry, when did you leave the CIA?
1990.
Oh, wow. So a while ago. But I mean, I'm assuming that you have some people that are still in the CIA. I mean, I'm not trying to sort of get you arrested. I'm just interested.
Now, as my grandmother used to say, there are dead now.
Oh dear. All right. So there are dead people. Well, the thing is, Edward Snowden, right? He must know people within that group. I mean, for God's sake, they're highly trained. I just don't see why they don't operate like, I mean, really what you're talking about is a system of spies and hackers that actually are working for humanity. And clearly that's one of the reasons why they're trying to also make the internet something so, like slow it down for everyone else unless you pay money to have a connection or whatever, ridiculous things.
Well, there are a lot of well-intentioned, highly technical people outside of government. Now, my favorite example is these hacker events that they used to run. They call it something different now, something a little bit more respectable. But I had the privilege.
Oh, what do they call it now?
Well, something like Advanced Technology Convention or something like that. Just, hackers. Well, actually, the way things have evolved is the real hackers, the ones, the original ones, have grown up. Now they're in their 30s. Now they're in their 40s. Now some of them are working for governments. Okay. So let me refer to one that I went to in Amsterdam in 2013. Okay.
Right. Can I be really rude? I've now made it my job here to try and read the messages because there's about 1 million of them.
Okay.
Hang on a sec. Kathy wants me to read the messages that Susie put. They have distributed cloud servers. So this is WikiLeaks. Hang on. Tony Kevin is the, oh, bloody hell. Hang on a sec. WikiLeaks has already done this. They have distributed cloud servers in multiple jurisdictions. And they release insurance files, which are batches of pending WikiLeaks releases to the public that are all encrypted. And people all around the world download those files and mirror them all over the place so that they can never all go missing or be taken down. Also allowed access to vetted, oh, see, I'm a genius. They've already done it. Okay. Also allowed access to vetted journals to propose articles from WikiLeaks docs. Right. So basically, they've done exactly what I said. So I must be some kind of genius, or I don't know what to say. But anyway, I'm glad that they've already done that. And now, Ray, I'm going to stop because I don't think there's any more messages. Hang on a sec. Wait a minute. There's one from Susie. Wait. Thank Joe. Yes. Okay. Also, Julian is one of the world's greatest cryptographers. So this is probably another reason why they want to get that guy behind bars, but he's not the only one. And sorry.
That's the point. He's not the only one. Okay. And it's not the case that the only ones work for governments. Okay. But what I'm saying here is that there were 6,000 people in this big field outside of Amsterdam, all of them hackers or high-tech people, okay? Now, Ed Snowden had just released this trove of documents in Hong Kong. That was in June 2013. Here we are in July of 2013. There were 4 of us there. Pauline Rowley, Thomas Drake, Jesselyn Radick, and myself, and Annie Machon from Great Britain. They had a spy panel. And after the spy panel, I get up and I said, now we have a problem.
Sorry. I'm sure I'm not the only one that doesn't know what the hell a spy panel is.
Well, that was a way of advertising 5 of us getting before the whole, actually it was half of them, 3,000 people, and talking about what had just happened with respect to Ed Snowden, okay? What he had revealed. Now, mind you, this is July of 2013, so it was just 3 weeks after. So I said, look, we have this problem. We have nominated Ed Snowden to be a Sam Adams winner of the Sam Adams Prize for Integrity and Intelligence. Now, our procedure requires that we give that to the winner in person. Julian Assange is a winner, okay? Bradley Manning, Chelsea Manning is a winner. And now we're wondering how we can get to Sheremetyevo Airport in Moscow to give Ed Snowden the award. Now, what happens? These high-tech people, okay, who care about what Ed Snowden has divulged, said, we're going to help. They got in the front, got some baskets, and they collected enough money among those 3,000 people to send us to Moscow, put us up in a far more decent hotel than I usually stay in, okay, for the duration, give the award to Ed Snowden, and come back all on their nickel, okay? The only thing they required was that we give, in addition to our traditional corner brightener candlestick holder, which is our Oscar, okay?
Mm-hmm.
They made one out of 3D. They made a 3D candlestick holder, and they said, please give this to Ed as well. He'll know what it is, and he'll appreciate it. So what I'm saying
Sorry,
here,
I'm lost on that. A 3D candle.
yeah, well, you know, you can use a Xerox type machine to build things these days.
Oh, right, yeah. So a 3D printer, right?
Okay.
So they were thinking, why not just send him a 3D printer candle instead of?
That's a 3D printer. That's the
Right,
terminology.
right.
So
Okay.
that's what we did. Now, what's the point there? The point is that a lot of these people, some of them now working for governments, but heavily respected, lots of kids running around, you know, no more teenage or early 20 hackers. These are established technical advisors now. They care so much. They cared so much about about Ed Snowden, what he had done, that they made it possible for us to go to Moscow, which we did in October. That's the earliest we could see him. And we were the first Westerners to even see him, even before his father did, to give him the award. And so that speaks volumes about the goodwill and the fixation on the integrity of cryptological systems and these kinds of things. And these were all people that had kind of grown up in this environment. The reason I mention it is because it's out of these people, it seems to me, that one can expect the kind of imaginative things that I cannot imagine right now, but that will make it possible for people who are really interested in real news, unadulterated news, no news from the mainstream media, that people in America and elsewhere can find out what's going on simply by hitting 2 keys, maybe, or 3, and being tuned into to this kind of service. So WikiLeaks is the forerunner of this, and my hope in the interim is to keep plugging away, but my hope eventually is that the technology will create these kinds of systems that will allow us to say, look, you don't have to read what you see in the New York Times. So this is where they're wrong, or this is what's missing. Just hit these 2 keys on your computer, and you can find out what's going on. That's my hope, at least.
Well, it's my hope as well. And you were an analyst at the CIA, right? Which means that you pored over information and you had to think about what it meant, which is what William Binney was trying to do with the kind of, I've forgotten the name of the design that he created. But, he was, sorry, what?
Thin thread was the...
Thin thread, right. Yeah. Well, if I may leap into metaphysics and religion here, obviously what we're looking at on this planet is a catastrophic spiritual plight. In other words, the fact that so much corruption can go on speaks to the fact that people spiritually are so weak or degraded or unconscious, unaware. I don't know what you want to describe it as, but let's just put forward this idea that there is a spiritual awakening going on, of which certainly I sense as being a very painful one. I think anyone who arrives at a level of awareness like Susie or yourself or myself, we've all gone through a lot of shit to get to the point where we care this much. I mean, I speak for myself. So, certainly I had to go through a lot to get to a level of awareness that I feel that came hard won and hard fought for, where I had to tear my soul apart to really see the truth of things and to be able to have it, despite not being able to do anything about it. But I think that the kinds of people that are involved in, Unity for J, or indeed anybody that cares about what happens to the world and all the living world, not just us, we're struggling against a sort of a spiritual atrophy or a spiritual, I can't think of the right word, but a terrible spiritual bonsai tree of humanity, like it's been clipped down so that all the actual growth that should happen naturally for each individual human being is being deliberately bonsaied, so that people are so restricted in terms of their knowledge, restricted so much also in terms of their spiritual creative natures. Gung, 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 another person to work in corporate world. You're 3 years old, you're going to have this reality, and boom, another slave to the corporation. So there's all kinds of forces at work here that what I would just like to suggest is that it's our responsibility, now that we've climbed out of the deep hole that we were all in, which is what I mean about the suffering part, that maybe we should actually just be like the old rabbis in the Kabbalistic, mystery schools, where you just go, hey, God gave us intelligence, so you know what? We're going to actually try and figure out the design of God's work, and then up came Kabbalah and the Tree of Life, and anyone who studies the Kabbalah or Tarot, will know that there's so much wisdom in that. And that came about because these rabbis just went, hey, we don't just have to stick to the Bible here. God gave us intelligence. Let's go for it. Let's try and figure this out. So I challenge humanity. Let's try and figure out how to bring about a civilized world. And certainly number one is what Julian is doing, which is bring the truth to the world so that people can think with it. And in which case, that also would include people thinking of educational sites where they don't put their children in school, but instead their children get to actually be educated. And out of that will, because we need, team mankind needs to grow. We can't have this team sheeple anymore. And they're not sheeple because they're losers. They're sheeple because they've been crushed. They've been cut down at the knees by people who have a vested interest in dominating this planet. And I'm going to say, I think those people are unnaturally, and in which case unnaturally desirous of dominating people. And I would suggest that they are spiritually bankrupt, insane individuals, because I don't know about you, but I wouldn't want to run the whole world and crush everyone, So I have to assume that there's something wrong with these people. And, Frank Serpico, going back to him, he said that he thought there should be a much, much more rigorous vetting of people that want to be police officers. And I think that they're, part of the knowledge we have to create, the design for a successful mankind, would have to include ways of recognizing the spiritual quality and nature of individuals that we put on in power. Because right now it's a, I don't know if this is the right expression, but it's a circus and pony show or whatever. You come on, you go, hey everybody, I'm so cool. I want you to vote for me because I'm terrific. That's got to end. Oh, hey, Joe. Sorry.
Am I on here?
You are on.
Well, that vetting is supposed to be called voting. That's right. Yes.
Yeah, but it's
vetting
not.
of who gets.
Yeah, it's not vetting, though. What it is it's seduction and.
Oh no, it's vetting.
Oh.
It's vetting, but the people don't do the vetting. Some very, very powerful people do the vetting before this process begins. Who gives us our candidates? That's where the vetting.
Well,
and then there's vetting after election and when you're in power as well. But again, not by the people, but by. Yeah.
you would.
Yes, you
think I would
can.
be
Whatever you
listening.
want. It's your show, Vivi. Take it away.
Yeah,
I know you
wish
love being in front of a camera, so
no,
go ahead.
no. What it is that I feel passionate about this, and I had to work myself up to come up tonight. Susie will vouch for me. I was like, I don't want to go on. They're going to have these conversations where they're going to be saying things that I really don't know anything about. But anyway, the consequence is now I'm this impossible 3-year-old. But I do really want to ask you both a sincere question, and it is kind of a horrible question. Apart from feeling that it's not possible, Ray, and Joe, maybe you feel that also it's an impossible struggle to straighten the world out. But have either of you ever had a sort of a visionary concept of how things should work? And certainly WikiLeaks and things like WikiLeaks would have to be part of that. Is that a cruel thing to ask you?
No, let me answer that this way. Very often things seem so solidified that a good solution is impossible. And let me just cite 2 of those situations where all of a sudden everyone, including me, of course, were surprised. When apartheid reigned in South Africa, the experts that I knew on that country, to a person, all believed that would be a terrible bloodbath. There was no way to avoid that. There would never be a peaceful solution. Well, we know what happened. Okay, was it a miracle? I don't know if I believe in miracles, but it was something approaching a miracle. The other thing was the fall of the Soviet Union. Now, I had studied Russian history and Soviet politics for about 4 decades before that happened. And I saw weakenings, but I never thought that Gorbachev and Shevardnadze would acquiesce in a peaceful transition, pulling 20 divisions, count them, 20 divisions, like 300,000 crackerjack troops out of East Germany, letting Germany be reunified. I mean, I would have looked at people saying, well, come on, that's not the real world, but it happened. So I guess what I'm saying is that we always have to be open to miracles. We always have to be open to things like, well, maybe what's going to happen in our country here in the US is that Trump is going to screw up things so royally, and the system will be receiving such a shock that someone with the kinds of values that we share will come to the fore, and the goodness of the American people will say, that's really what we want. And who knows, maybe 3 years from now, we'll have such a candidate, or 2 years from now, and things will change. So one has to be open to miracles, and that's what gives me hope. Meanwhile, it's good not to expect immediate success. It's good to plug along and do the good because it's worth doing.
Well, I do appreciate what you said, but it wasn't an answer to my question. My question was a design for civilization. If it had occurred to you, if it hasn't, that's fine. I was just interested if you'd ever sat there dreaming up after all your analysis of the way the world works when you worked at the CIA. I thought maybe, well, I challenge you to dream up this new civilization that we might have. But Joe, have you ever kind of put your mind to the idea of how would you organize humanity so that actually the really good people would rise instead of the great people while I eat my chocolate?
No.
Oh, Joe, you can't just say no. Come on.
Well, in my younger days, when I read people like Enrico Malatesta and Bakunin and, the various anarchists, but anarcho-syndicalists, they talked about organizing society where we would not really have leaders anymore, where workers would own and control their own factories and workplaces and farms, and there would be no central government, and people would be able to administer their own affairs by themselves without need of an authoritarian or state. And Karl Marx famously said, or infamously said, that the state would wither away, and then the Soviet Union became one of the most dominant repressive states ever. So, and the United States is maybe topping that now. So, you know, there were ideas that were in the 19th century that were quite alive and tried to be acted upon. There were factories taken over in Italy and other places. And what happened, the police came in, pretty much crushed them. So the state is not going to allow, and I do believe humans have it within them, at least in local areas, to organize affairs for themselves in a non-authoritarian way. So the idea of putting the right people in power, it's about reducing power positions. Because as you aptly pointed out previously, to get to those very powerful top positions, you can't be a nice person. You've got to destroy lots of other people on the way up there. And the old saying goes, be nice to the people on the way up because you're going to meet them on the way down. But these people never seem to suffer. Who whatever crimes they've committed or whatever they've taken part in, they get pardoned, or they are not ever prosecuted for torture and launching illegal wars and invasions and stuff like that. So I'm not that I hold much hope out for this anymore, but as I said, when I was younger, I believed that society had to be reorganized in a way where these powerful positions no longer existed, and that there was much more leveling going on, and society worked for itself. Working people were able to run their own affairs. Now, the idea of the Soviets and the Soviet Union kind of started out that way. There would be workers' councils. There have been various attempts at that, even Gaddafi in Libya and Cuba, but there was always still a strong state and a very strong leader of those states. And they always act with impunity when they're above the law. So this is the unfortunate situation that we're in. And so I don't give much thought anymore to how to reorganize society, even though we have like an hour left. It would take much longer than that to discuss how to reorganize society. My job as a journalist all these years, as a reporter, has been simply to describe the society as it exists, so that people have an idea of what's going on and how bad it could be, and that the people with impunity cannot get away with it and hide behind their power and their position. And this is what the press should do, obviously, is to hold those people in power to account, to reveal what they do. And the press has done that increasingly less and less as they become more and more beholden to government as sources. But that's where WikiLeaks came in. They filled that void by allowing very, very courageous people. We talk on these vigils not enough, I think, about the people who made WikiLeaks possible. And those are the whistleblowers. People who risk their lives, who risk, they risk their jobs and their freedom to do what was right, which was to pass on these documents, knowing that they could wind up imprisoned, to WikiLeaks to publish, because they knew the public had to know this. And of course, Chelsea Manning was one of the WikiLeaks sources that was in prison. They've also arrested someone and charged him at CIA with having given the Vault 7 leaks to WikiLeaks that Ray was talking about. So it's an enormous risk, and the whistleblowers, we shouldn't have to have them in a functioning press that would be doing this on a more regular basis. Now, when the press publishes classified information, it's often leaked by the intelligence agencies themselves. So they want this stuff to get out for whatever would serve their interests, their powerful interests. But there's less and less of the media revealing information that exposes the misdeeds of those in power. And that's what WikiLeaks has done. And that's why they want to crush them. And it's a real indictment of the press that they've turned against Julian Assange for partisan reasons, that he's somehow enemy number one right now, because he, as we were discussing earlier, they think he had something to do with Trump winning, and then he may have had there was emails may have had something to do with it, but Clinton was the main reason she lost. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And what was, as Ray said before, what was Assange supposed to do? Sit on emails? Had he received emails from the Republican Party National Committee or other things about Trump, do you think he would have really sat on them? I doubt it. I really think obviously would have published it. And because he didn't, does that mean that he wasn't supposed to publish the Democratic National Committee or the Podesta emails? No. I mean, and when did he get them? Some people complained that he should have put them out earlier in the primary process, because it might have helped Bernie if we knew at the time that the Democrats, the DNC and Hillary were doing these things to undermine his candidates, but he didn't have them, obviously. I mean, you get when you get them, and you have to vet them, and there's a long process that they go through before publication. So people say a lot of things they don't know what they're talking about. And yes, Vivian, but we have Ann Garrison here too, who could jump in anytime she wants.
Hey, Ann.
Hi there.
I don't want you, Ann, to get the idea that I've been talking the whole night away here. You came in. I've actually had very little to say tonight, but go on.
I know. I've been wall to wall talking. I've been very bad. I haven't shared.
It's 24 hours. My cat wanted some media attention too, but she got fed up and was sitting on my other friend's lap. Let's see.
Can I just ask something? Sorry, because I just had asked Joe, to say what he envisioned or envisions for how society could be changed so that the problems that we have now that require a WikiLeaks would change materially. If, in other words, I'm saying that we have a responsibility to start really, really thinking about how do we reorganize society. And I don't mean like, are you a communist? Are you a Democrat? Are you an anarchist? Please make sure the above questions are asked. Susie just sent me this very demanding thing. Hang on a sec. Joe Lauria, what is your take on the NBC whistleblower journalist who quit this week because of their servitude to intel agents and warmongers? And then another question for Joe, Ray, and me, and you now, and how different might the world look today were Julian Assange not cut off over 8 months ago from communicating via internet, phone, visitations, etc.? Okay. So, seeing as I seem to be the only one that can actually just about read these micro messages on this bloody app, I have sort of turned into you, Joe. Okay.
Well, how about Ann try to answer that last question?
Okay, I was going to answer the earlier one.
All right.
About how we're going to transform the world.
Okay.
Okay. I see several movements that so fundamentally change the relations between people and the planet that they have transformational potential. One of them is sustainable, and in many cases this means urban farming, to replace agriculture, including animal agriculture.
God, I totally support that.
Okay, and another is out here we have what are called municipal renewable energy buyers co-ops, and this means that you get your local government, your city council, county council, or even a regional body to become a renewable energy buyers club. So it changes the relationship between the people and the power companies. It doesn't completely do away with the power companies because they've got all the capital to build whatever anybody's going to contract with them to build, but the consumers become the buyers. Okay, so this has happened in Marin County. They established a renewable energy buyers co-op, and it's become regional. I can't remember how many municipalities are involved in it now, but they contracted with Shell, but they told Shell, we don't want your filthy oil and natural gas. We want renewable energy. We want solar and wind. And that's what Shell is providing them. The other one, and this is the really big one, is the public banking movement.
I mean, really, everything that you're talking about is decentralization, which I totally agree with.
Yeah.
And in fact, Joe's vision of, although he seems to be feeling a bit cynical about the likelihood of it happening, his was also a vision of decentralization and empowerment of the individual. Well, obviously, maniacal psychopaths want it the completely other way around, which is currently what we have. And in fact, I was suggesting that, the opposite side of the coin of knowledge is the creation of knowledge. And that maybe it would be very productive to, in addition to exposing the truth and the lies and the corruption, that we actually maybe have vigils of people coming on where we really, really start creating knowledge and creating not, top-down models, but a very different kind of paradigm, which, and this is the critical nightmarish point, requires that human beings raise their consciousness to the point where they are interested in being fair and truthful and have integrity. I mean, none of the shit that goes on this planet could happen if everyone had their integrity squared away, and so I actually would like to propose that part of Discord, because this would make Julian relevant way beyond just exposing corruption, would be for really amazing human beings that start to work on a blueprint for a new civilization. And I'm not talking about something of a utopian nature. I'm talking about just brilliant organization with policy that is well understood and established, so that I hope I'm not being too irrelevant to Julian, because I don't feel like I am, because I think that's what Julian's trying to do. He's trying to bring about a world where people are able to function, and I think it's the majority of the world, in a cohabitating fashion, instead of this strange kind of master-slave paradigm that we've seemed to have been doing since the bloody Egyptians. It's like, when is it going to stop this sort of psycho guy at the top and the slaves at the bottom? Because that is the paradigm.
Probably never.
No, don't say that.
Since
No.
I want to bring in Kathy Vogan here. Kathy, how are you? Thanks for joining us. If you, I could start you off
I want to say
with a
something.
couple of questions. Yes.
Can I just one thing? I wanted to add that when I listed those three things, sustainable agriculture, et cetera, the one I would add to them is what Julian has created, the transparency movement.
Oh God, yes.
Okay, that's all.
Kathy.
Hey, Kathy.
Hello
Hello there.
from Sydney. We're all melting here.
Really?
It's got so hot and humid that the same day I had two paintings fall off the wall simultaneously. I used those on hooks, and I scared the hell out of my dog. And incidentally, Vivian, a little while ago, so did your cat. Your cat was meowing away. And I think, Joe, you said last week, be careful that the dog doesn't see the cat, but it's my dog this week. And he was, where is it? He's not very good with cats. So I guess you would like some news from Australia. We have had some breaking news, and maybe this is the levy breaking. So I'm just going to put on my glasses. And so Christine Assange was just tweeting this out a little while ago, and I saw it circulate in our chat window before I actually came in. But it relates to a gentleman called Tony Kevin. So Tony Kevin was a former Australian ambassador, and he has come out in support of Julian Assange. So this is big. I'd just like to read you what Tony Kevin wrote 5 hours ago. So he starts off with, maybe I should share my screen, folks. Is that appropriate? Yes, probably is. So you can look. Won't be a second. Share. And I'll go to Chrome. I'll share my sound just in case, but there's no audio on this. Can everyone see?
Yes.
Yes. So Ozpol. So there is no obligation under ANZUS or Five Eyes intel sharing obligations to prevent any Australian government, and remember that successive governments have failed, Julian, whether they were on the right or the left, in bringing Assange home safely now from the UK under effective consular protection of our national. So David Hicks. David Hicks was an Australian who was kind of in the wrong place at the wrong time and got carted off for 5 years to Guantanamo Bay.
Sorry,
And-
Kathy, can I interrupt you? Susie just gave you a very important message on the chat. Can you just look at it quickly?
Yes, sure.
Yeah.
Check that. Now I'm not able to see it. I'm going to stop sharing for a moment.
Okay.
So, goodness gracious. So I'll just end the share. Oh yes, sorry. Stop share. Okay, so now I think I can look at the chat. Chat. Okay. Yes. Right, so I think there are something in that statement that is being changed at the moment, but I can actually relate some of it.
We've got Kathy. We have the
Joe,
original statement here.
I see that, Joe. You've got a copy, and then I can possibly give some.
Yeah, you can tell us who David Hicks was. So this is a British, Australian ambassador who says there's no obligation under ANZUS of the Five Eyes until sharing obligations to prevent any Australian government from bringing Julian Assange home safely, now from the UK under our effective consular protection of our national. David Hicks suffered in Guantanamo because John Howard wanted him there. The Australian government could have brought him home anytime it wanted, as Lee Sales' excellent book made clear. Our governments need to grow some and defend rights to free publication of public interest material by an outstanding Australian journalist. If you support what Daniel Ellsberg did with the Pentagon Papers, if you support what Woodward and Bernstein did to expose Watergate, if you suppose what Edward Snowden did, if you support Guardian and New York Times publications of WikiLeaks material, which they did, then you have to support Australian consular protection of Assange from vindictive U.S. vengeance, which we know is in train. It is simply about press freedom. Why the silence, Australian media? Have you read Rudy Giuliani's good advice to Trump on this? Tony Kevin, Australian ambassador. So we want to comment on that and fill us in with some of the details that non-Australians are not aware of.
Well, I don't know Tony Kevin all that well, but I do know that in 2017 he published a book called Return to Russia. He'd been there a long time before, and he went back to Russia and found it to be quite a different place. What I also know about Tony Kevin is that he has been protesting quite a deal about Australia engaging in arms trade with Saudi Arabia. He is an anti-war guy, and anybody who is, that was the fundamental thing that brought me to WikiLeaks when Julian said, if we can have a more healthy and truthful media environment, we have a hope of a more peaceful environment. And he also said that most of the wars in the previous 50 years had been actually started on media lies, and that ordinary people don't want to go to war. They have to be fooled into war. So anybody who's, that was my thing. I kind of really latched onto the WikiLeaks anti-war agenda, because, that seemed to be such an important part of it. There was also this, this thing about privacy for us as citizens and transparency for governments. And in fact, of course, it's flipped the other way around. And it would be great if we could establish a new Magna Carta for the web, as Tim Berners-Lee would call it, but standards of truthfulness, both in Parliament and the media, harsher penalties for bullshitting. But, what we've seen was...
Sorry.
What we've seen, that's all right. What we've seen is the 1948 Propaganda Act repealed as part of the NDAA. So, in fact, and that was, that's been happening 2012. 31st of December, while everyone was watching the fireworks, I suppose, 2012, that was kind of a big turning point. What everybody noticed was that America had suddenly codified their right to some kind of international jurisdiction where they could pick up anybody anywhere in the world, any citizen, if they were suspected of being involved, giving material aid, for example, to a terrorist organization. Yeah, that scared us all. That was the one that really made the headlines because it spoke of this extraterritoriality that is still being used to chase Julian Assange, who was not an American citizen. This is doubly grave. It's not just the threat to the First Amendment, but it's threatening journalists all around the world. And we have laws, the kind of canary in the coal mine, if you like, is, you know, the weakest part of Five Eyes Australia, bringing in the testing these grounds with the foreign interference laws. And so they, you know, once, would you believe that in there we have that element from the 1917 Espionage Act where it is, you know, punishable if you even handle or transmit state secrets, right? So this is something that a lot of journalists have been, Helen Razor, who's been on the Vigil, Bernard Keane, who hasn't been on yet, but they're writing they're both writing for a newspaper called Crikey. So these two in particular are ringing the alarm bells in Australia. We have to have, you know, provide resistance to this here, because if it works in Australia, then it can be, you know, safely implemented in the rest of the world. So what you've got happening, you know, that takes us away from that ideal and utopian situation in the future, which we would all love to be able to rely on public information and know what our politicians are doing in our name and hold them to account. I think that was the phrase you were looking for before, Vivian.
Yes.
But US law has been going in the opposite direction for, you know, hardcore for the last 6 years. And I, you know, quite frankly, I see it as panic. They just don't know how to deal with the age of information. You know, suddenly, I mean, they had total control of the narrative for aeons, and then suddenly there's this digital disruption where information is flying in every direction, and it's really hard to keep control of the narrative. And it's clear that is that moment that has gone, long gone. You know, knowledge wants to be free, to quote, you know, it's a good WikiLeaks slogan. But one of our most important journalists in Australia, Mary Kostakidis, said that the transmission of information, truthful information, is an unstoppable tide. So what's going to happen is, well, on the one side, they're bringing in all of these panic laws to shut it down, Mr. President, shut it down now. But at the same time, it's like whack-a-mole, as I think we've said recently. There's always another one that's going to pop up. And indeed, with all this opposition, which has been terrible since 2010, you know, when Amazon tried to kick WikiLeaks off they did in fact kick them off their servers. Well, I mean, there was the WikiLeaks IP address being published by one newspaper. Was it the New York Times, Joe? I think it might have been. Or the Washington Post. I think it's one of the
Pentagon Papers.
No, not the Pentagon Papers. When there was an attempt to shut WikiLeaks down, and this is back in 2010. So people were being asked and let to it to mirror WikiLeaks site, the WikiLeaks site in a lot of countries, right? So if it went down in one place, it was there in another. It never even disappeared. So everything was mirrored. But you know, you had also mainstream news. I think the journalists weren't allowed to publish the IP address. The the website address of WikiLeaks, but they just put out the IP address. It might even have been the Guardian, actually. Back then, quite good relations. But people around the world, journalists around the world, and also, those politicians that deserve to be there because they've got real foresight. They can look ahead, right into the 21st century and project, what is good for humanity in the long term. Well, I think all of them are popping up and continue to pop up and will save WikiLeaks, and are doing their best to save the man that brought us this. I mean, what noble intentions, what service. Now, when we get to David Hicks, that's an interesting story because he was arrested and accused of working with the Taliban and being a terrorist. So he wasn't a journalist or anything like that. I know David Hicks well. I actually did a 9-hour interview with him. Only some of it has been published, but the whole story of Gitmo from beginning to end with his wife lawyer, Alicia Brooks. So some of that's been published. But what is particularly significant about David is that he should have been released a long time earlier. All right. He was a little guy. There was reason to release him, but there were, our Prime Minister at the time, John Howard, did not want to do that. And it's the same kind of, I just had this French word in my ear, obeisance, obeying orders of the, what they thought the United States would prefer. But what happened in Australia is that there was an enormous campaign for to release David Hicks. As you were driving out of the city along the, the highway out, David Hicks's face was on every telegraph pole, and just everywhere in the city you looked, just ordinary people were getting out there and delivering that one message, free David Hicks. And we can do that again for Julian. And there's been a massive change in the since this last year, since Unity for J started. We've come a long way. Finally, with the EU parliamentarians jumping in to support Julian, and I would suggest to Australian politicians, they've always looked up to Europe, and they shouldn't so much look up to the UK now. The behaviour is disgusting, but they've always looked up to Europe as well. And America looks up to Europe as well as being the ones who have this rich, long-term tradition. And Britain does too, has a wonderful history in terms of its laws. But Australia should take the example of the European parliamentarians. And I can see that Tony Kevin, who is not in our parliament anymore, he was an ambassador before. I think that they should look at what Tony Kevin is saying as well.
Why do you think that there is not Julian Assange's picture on every telephone pole?
I think that it's going to come. I think it's going to come. There are things happening. People are doing petitions, which I feel are very, very useful. They're the ones who are getting the European Parliament, where we are in Unity for J, are providing the text as well, the background information that then parliamentarians can take the baton with. We've done a lot of the background information. But then once those voices with real authority start speaking out, that's when all of their constituents listen and act on it. So all we need is to have some Labour politicians, some Greens politicians, and we do have Scott Ludlam, but isn't it funny how it's always former politicians, former ambassadors, former CIA analysts that voice so vehemently, so wholeheartedly, and with hardcore evidence their support for Julian Assange. But we have a dearth of the ones who are actually in their positions, because they're the ones who are going to get Julian's photograph on every telegraph pole on the highway.
Yeah, and it's the elected officials who need to be doing that. They have the freedom to do that. Yes.
Sorry, I just want to say, I heard Ron Paul say that all of the US Congress and any representative is forbidden to speak about anything that they know for a year after they leave office. And I'm sure it's the same in England. I mean, I actually heard Ron Paul say that.
That's absolutely incorrect.
Oh, well, he said it.
There's part of the Constitution, it's the speech and debate clause, Article 6, I think, I forget which. Anyway, there is a speech and debate clause, and it clearly says that no member of Congress, the House or the Senate, can be questioned on any matter while going to or from and while in the middle of a legislative act. What does that mean? If you're on the floor of the Senate or the House, or if you're going to the Senate or the House, or if there's a legislative act or a legislative meeting held outside the Capitol building in Washington, let's say in another city, you can say whatever you want and cannot be questioned by the police. You can reveal any classified information and not be guilty of anything, including the Espionage Act. You are allowed to do that. And that was what Senator Mike Gravel, who was on this show 3 weeks ago, I believe, did. That's the clause that he used from the Constitution, allowed him to read the highly classified, top secret Pentagon papers on television. The 3 networks that the U.S. had in those days all covered it live, which he then broke down in tears. He read the Pentagon papers and was put into the congressional record, and later he published it as a book. Now, that act of publishing out a book was not protected by that. That made him liable to prosecution, but the Nixon administration didn't do it. But on the floor of the House or the Senate or in any legislative act, you could say whatever you want. So I don't know what Ron Paul's talking about. You have to
I'm
for a year. That's nonsense.
I'm going to find that, because I was like going, wow, that's really bullshit. How is it that you leave and you're not allowed to open your mouth about
No, you can do it while you're in the Senate or the House. Senator Dick Durbin, who's still, I believe, in the Senate, said at one point in a speech on the floor that we knew that there really was no WMD in Iraq, but we couldn't say it because it was classified. Well, he was lying. He knows that he could have said that, and maybe it prevented a war if he and other senators had stood forward and said, we are not convinced by this evidence. If Colin Powell had not given his vile display at the UN Security Council, in which he knew that half of what he was saying was very dodgy, if not untrue, he went ahead and did it anyway. He was a good soldier. He was acting still like a soldier, but he was actually in a civilian job where he did not have to obey the president right then, as he would as chief of staff or as any military man has to. He could have resigned then. All those senators and congressmen could have revealed what they knew, but they were all cowards, and they didn't do that. So again, if you find that about Ron Paul, I'd like to know exactly what he said, because
I will find it, because he definitely said it, because I felt this outrage that would be the case, because that's just bullshit. That's like a non-disclosure clause. How's that work?
Yeah.
Anyway, okay.
So I was just thinking about I think it's a 2011 interview that Australian journalist Mark Davis did with Julian. And Julian speaks about the Australian Labor Party being compromised by the CIA since the days of Gough Whitlam. Now, that was our prime minister in the early 70s, early to mid 70s. And, this prime minister and his attorney general, Lionel Jospin, they really didn't like the idea of these secret bases, American bases. And they were thinking particularly of Pine Gap, which was used at that point in time simply to spy, as Malcolm Fraser, who was the prime minister after Gough, said in his book, Dangerous Allies, that now we are also targeting the drones. The Americans just push the button, but Australia is much more complicit now in American wars. They were just spying before And now they're actually very actively participating in the surveillance and targeting, the cross-referencing of vocal I don't need to go into the technical details of it, but, you know, Malcolm Fraser said that America thinks they can, you know, that they can have these wars of aggression in other countries because they have codified it with the Patriot Act, but Australia hasn't. Australia, you know, is very vulnerable to prosecution further down the track, and very vulnerable because there are so many US bases in Australia. So, you know, the thing is that, and coming right down the track with the Australian Labor Party, you know, this is coming forward to the Julia Gillard government, and this was the Prime Minister, a lawyer, who said that Julian had done an illegal act by publishing. So there was someone in her government called Mark Abib, and he was actually just listening in and communicating everything back to Washington. I mean, if this had been happening in the other direction, where there were people sitting in Congress who were reporting directly back to the Australian government, you know, all hell would have broken loose. But Australia just went with that. So, you know, what I have to say to Labor politicians is, you know, following the advice or the orders of America is going to get us into a lot of trouble. You know, if we really want to be a sovereign nation, you know, there's got to be a break like this. Break away from it, and you'll be doing so much good. Think about the long-term interest in stopping this persecution, not only of Julian Assange, but of the press, of journalists in general. That is incredibly dangerous for how we understand the future. Yeah. We've had a lot of we've all missed Julian since he's been offline, and yes, I can imagine that had he been able to testify in the UK and in the US, that we would have seen a very different impression of the world in the last 7 months. So, you know, gagging journalists like this is not doing anybody any good.
Did you say, Kathy, that Whitlam was opposed to American bases in Australia?
Absolutely, and in fact, he and his Attorney General Lionel Jospin, Jospin stormed Pine Gap.
Did that have
police in there?
Did it have anything to do with? Did that have anything to do with the Queen dismissing?
Yeah.
By any chance?
Of course. Now, there is a really good book called The Falcon and the Snowman by a writer called Christopher Boyce, who was working on the other end, you know, and actually writes about what the chat was there inside the CIA. So our Governor General was called John Kerr, and they were calling him our man Kerr, right? And so he was the representative of the Queen of England, who a lot of people in Australia go a bit funny when you say the citizenship test, right? I got my citizenship before I went to America. I was getting a little bit worried about being a dual national, and I failed. I'd been living here since school days, and I failed just one of the questions. Out of 20, I only got 19, right? And the one that I got wrong was, who is the head of state of Australia? And I said Julia Gillard, and wrong. And then John Kerr, wrong. And of course it was the Queen of England, right? So then, even funnier than that, I went in to see my friends, who both 50 years old, both of them at the time, had been born in Australia, probably 5th generation Australians. And I said, I passed my citizenship test, but I got one wrong. And they said, what did you get wrong? And I said, who's the head of state of Australia? And they said Julia Gillard too. And that was really, really weird. We'd been debrained in a way.
Well, it's
into
head of
thinking,
government.
yeah, thinking
Head
we're
of
a
government, not
sovereign
different head of
nation.
state. You know, in
But
looking, yeah,
but
in looking
when
at this,
Goff wanted to do a lot of other things,
yeah.
like nationalize industry and stop
Ah,
foreign ownership of Australia as well.
can't have that.
So, and if you look him up, folks, look him up. He's the best, by far, the best Prime Minister Australia has ever had. And I'm not saying that for partisan reasons. You could just go and look at the list of things he did for Australia in the few years that he was here. He changed everything in terms of education, health, you know, equality between the people. For the first generation, for many people, you know, of their family, first generation, they could go to university because that was only for the rich before. And unfortunately, it's gone back to being today only for the rich as well, because the fees are enormous for an education. Young people are indebted again for life. And so those who don't have money are excluded from an education. But Goff's time, he was a politician with vision that could look forward 50 years and see that, you know, today in Australia, Goff's policies are still benefiting Australia and have really benefited us in terms of technology, everything, even Wi-Fi, which we kind of invented. But, you know, the thing was that Goff was disobedient to the United States. And, you know, that there was, John Kerr was told to get rid of him. And Malcolm Fraser played into it. He was the Liberal politician, but he was an old school Liberal. And he, you know, Dangerous Allies, his book that he wrote not long before he died a couple of years ago, is really worth a read. People said that Malcolm changed his politics, and Malcolm just said, no, I didn't. I've always been the same. And he was very, very strong in supporting refugees. He saved all those boat people as well. He was, you know, so he said the world changed around me. And
what would Goff's position be on Julian Assange if you were?
Oh my God, I would say that Goff would have had him out a long time ago. You know, he's like you know, he was an atypical Labour leader because he was coming from a rather wealthy family and had he was a barrister as well. And he knew how to talk to these people who were, you know, old school Thai type of people. And he would just rush things in because the Australian people needed it. It was good for us. So he made these decisions, just about all of them were incredibly beneficial to our country. We owe a lot to him. But funny enough, I can just tell you this little anecdote that I remember one night at Politics in the pub, there was a discussion about Goff, and I think it might have been just after he died, actually. And I polled the audience, and I said, you know, which Australian politician could be our next Goff? And the response was unanimous. It was Scott Ludlam. It was Scott, because Scott has this mentality as well. This mental capacity as well of being able to project into the future, and this courage to defy orders from on high. You know, we have to look after Australia's interests. We don't want to get into trouble in the Southeast Asia pivot. David Hicks was very concerned about that as well. But we're being put like, you know, the meat in the sandwich between America and China in terms of trade relations. So, you know, but the greatest concern here is that, you know, we have enormous number of military bases in the north of Australia and also over in Adelaide as well. And, you know, a lot of our bases, their weapons are pointing toward China. how does China feel about this? And how can we say you're our friend when, there's still this embarrassing obligation, it seems, to do what America wants. We have to break free from that. We really do. And, I would really make a plea to the Labour Party, and I would make a plea to the ABC. Politics in the Pub opens on 7th of February, and our first mission is to try and save the independence of our national broadcaster. So we're supporting you, and everybody at Politics in the Pub supports WikiLeaks and Julian Assange. And they really believe in the Popular Front idea that, we can all agree on these basic principles that guarantee our liberty and a sane world as well. Christine Assange, I've just put out another little film of her talking about what guarantees liberty. I'd ask people to take a look at it. It's from the August interview, but there's some little gems in there, words of wisdom that really need to come out on their own. And I thought that was the one of the week. It's been a bit long from me, sorry.
Kathy, could I ask you a question that came in from one of the viewers? And that is, how different might the world look today with Julian Assange not cut off over 8 months ago from communicating via internet, phone, visitations, etc.?
Well, because I had been so interested in exploring the evil of Cambridge Analytica, who were involved with the Trump campaign. Alexander Nix said they were running it, were involved in Brexit, for so long that was denied, but then an invoice for £37,000 was found directly from Cambridge Analytica, but also their sister company, Aggregate IQ. So all of the Leave campaigns, I think 7 of them, were all spending their money in the same shop and engaging in what looked like collaboration. A couple of electoral laws broken, overspending because they weren't really operating as separate campaigns. So there's been call for a second referendum on that basis. But the thing is that I think Cambridge Analytica was something that Julian wanted to talk about. He wanted to testify on that in the UK, and I believe it in just trying to think of Senate Judiciary Committee as well in the United States as well. And he was told by the leading Democrat that the only way that they would speak to Julian was if he were in custody. Right. Well, he's almost tantamount to custody. So why don't they bloody speak to him now? So I think finding out more about this this organization, which essentially was injecting lies into the bloodstream of the internet, directed towards the most vulnerable people in our society, mass surveillance, identifying vulnerable people who would believe conspiracy theories. Oh, it's a terrible mess. So I think that the information that Julian could have given the world on that would have been a real revelation. And I think in more recent times on the Integrity Initiative, and I find that this is, there's a great irony here that Guardian journalists who worked so hard to expose Cambridge Analytica then found themselves, wittingly or not, involved with another foreign interference outfit, which is obviously what the Integrity Initiative is. And these Guardian journalists were actually asserting Russian, some of them asserting Russian interference, but the best ones were talking about American interference, foreign interference with Cambridge Analytica that was an American company. So that would be what I'd want to hear. I'd also really, this is a slightly different question, but it's a question that WikiLeaks crowdsourced not quite a week ago. So what would people like to see? What documents would most change our impression of the world today? And one of those, there are a lot, but the one I chose to talk about was the over 500,000 documents that the Australian government has in relation to Julian Assange. I think great lessons could be learned if they were actually, even one page was revealed and not one page.
Could you repeat that again? The Australian government has 500,000 pages of documents about Julian Assange?
Yes. This was revealed under freedom of information. Well, there was a freedom of information request put in, and the reply from the Australian government was, I believe it was DFAT, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, that unfortunately it's too much work because there's over 500,000 documents, and they did nothing. So therefore you can't release a single page of what's there. And Australia are not supposed to be getting involved. Well, why did they have 500,000 documents to date? And this news was only revealed a couple of months ago.
This is a question that perhaps is impossible for you to answer, but I just wonder why the lawyers of Assange can't subpoena those documents. I mean, I would have thought they're incredibly significant to his case.
Well, I'm not, that would be a question that you could take up with Greg Barnes, but I'm sure that if Greg Barnes could have done that, he would have. And I don't actually think that lawyers have the right to compel a government department to release information. They didn't say it was, for national security reasons. They actually just said because there's too many, which blew us all away. It blew Felicity Ruby away. Because, Felicity Ruby? How
I don't. No, I'm afraid I'm completely out of it as far as anything Australian, except for kangaroos, which I like.
All right. So Felicity did her PhD in WikiLeaks. And she's the one who gave us that wonderful list of how WikiLeaks had aided humanity all around the world. So that's a wonderful moment that should be shared. But Felicity has worked closely with Julian and Scott Ludlam for 8 years, I believe, and possibly even more, only that long that I am aware of. But, she's a great authority and continues to battle for Julian. And we've had her here on the Vigil. She is a fountain of knowledge. And Joe, I would suggest that you get her back on again. She's better than me.
Is she American or Australian?
Aussie.
Aussie.
She's an Aussie. Yeah. She's one of our most informed. She's a consultant, political consultant. She's not a journalist, although she does publish things. But, she's been a speechwriter for politicians. And I don't think it's my place to say which ones, but ones that we care about a lot. Have trusted her. So, you can hear more from her. And I would like to bring Greg Barnes on as well, if we could. If you're out there, Greg, you could talk more about this. I know Greg has talked about, back in 2012, in Adelaide, there was a WikiLeaks conference called WikiLeaks and Democracy. And Greg Barnes spoke at length about the doctrine of diplomatic protection, where Australia has the right to save one of our citizens if it is being threatened by another country, and that goes that goes beyond all local laws. That the doctrine of diplomatic protection is something that every state has the right to execute in relation to the protection of its citizens wherever they are in the world. So there's plenty of ways that Australia could have just ended this years ago, but it is subservience and even best guessing what America might want. But I think it's time to really have it out. You've got Giuliano, Trump's lawyer, who's saying that. I don't know if it's a good or a bad thing. It seems like a bit weird that Trump's lawyer would say this, but I think I'm kind of going Vivian's way in terms of feel.
You mean, okay. Yeah, back to Giuliani, where we all started in the last
Yeah.
minutes. The problem with Giuliani is if Trump gave a pardon to Assange based on advice from Giuliani, what the political consequences for him would be.
What would they be?
We here on this Vigil, and anyone who's nonpartisan and is looking at principle and the law sees what Giuliani said to be correct. And his examples were apt because the Pentagon Papers case, the New York Times, no one at the New York Times went to jail or the Washington Post. But everyone in this political partisanship that we're living in here sees Giuliani having said that only because they're protecting their bag man. It was Assange who got the stuff from the Russians and did it to help Trump win. So
yeah, but listen, let's just go. No, wait.
If he pardons Assange, everyone would say, "See, he's doing it because they help the Russians, not because it's principle on principle." And you know what? If they did it for the partisan reason, we shouldn't care. He should just pardon them.
But Joe, you're not underlining the key thing, which is that Julian released factual evidence of crimes. So, you can say that Giuliani and Trump, and all of them are terribly evil people working for Russia, and they all have Russian family and secret dachas in, St. Petersburg. You can say anything you like. The fact is, though, the documents speak for themselves, and they talk of horrendous crimes committed by the US government and the military. I just don't know why people just don't drop all the stuff about, let's say it was the biggest maneuver in the history of, all time that Giuliani said, hey, I think we should let Assange go just to get the heat off of Trump. I still say, why doesn't anyone just actually look at the great big long list of crimes and start talking about that?
Yeah, if I may make a comment on that as well. So last week, Ray McGovern was talking about Vault 7. And one of the things that Julian could have shown was who did not hack, right? And in fact, we know that there is forensic evidence that the material was copied onto a USB stick. It was leaked, right? So in fact, if you get on both sides this evidence that veterans, professions, for intelligence professionals for sanity provided, which, Ray is still lamenting that it's been kept out of the mainstream news, but let that in and let everybody know about the marble framework and these little breadcrumbs that, this at least is plausible deniability, but we have the forensic evidence that there was no hack at all. And you see, this whole thing about Trump owes Assange one, right? And you see, that proves it. Well, that's just playing into the DNC narrative. It is. And so the whole thing could be blown out of the water.
And what do you think the New York Times and MSNBC play into? The DNC narrative.
Absolutely. Yeah, but so what I'm saying is that it has to come out on both sides. I don't see, what is this, a pardon for what? A pardon in advance. I don't think it can be actually framed in that way. But I think, the next thing is Trump has to defend the press, defend the First Amendment. You put it in those terms, and then you allow out, Trump allows out, he does have a fair amount of influence on the media, everything that VIPs discovered, the actual forensic proof. Let Assange talk and say who didn't hack. He was trying to negotiate at the time for a bit of immunity in order to tell the truth, which, this issue, this was really, really scary. Oh my God, they know about our ability to implant a false digital footprint. Oh my God, that was their most important tool. So, I think once this has to become public, and then Trump can defend the First Amendment and maybe frame it like, I'd rather have WikiLeaks than fake news. something like that.
Well, that would go down well, but there is a precedent, by the way, for pardoning someone before a crime, before they were charged with a crime formally. And we know that that Assange has been charged. And that would be Gerald Ford, when he became president after Nixon resigned, he pardoned Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon had never been impeached. He was about to be, and that's why he quit. And he was never charged with any crime. So but Ford pardoned him in case he was. Well, as a private citizen, there was fears that they could be going after him, the government or somebody, and some prosecutor somewhere. So he did pardon him before crime was charged. But he's been charged, Assange. We know that now by the government. We don't know the details yet.
Can I ask you a question?
Could pardon him.
Can I ask a question, Joe, about that? So, we know that in the Eastern District Court of Virginia, there was a document that was copy-pasted from, most likely from the Manning era. Now, does that have to be actually unsealed?
No.
Once it's in there, I mean, as far as I can see, it's only a possible charge until it's actually unsealed. Can it actually be dropped without even being unsealed? Well, that courtroom is less than 3 miles from where I'm sitting right now. So I was in the courtroom that day when the Reporters Committee for Freedom, I think that's the name, was giving their points in the law, in the petition that they put before the judge. And I heard the assistant district attorney say that he admitted they made a mistake in letting that one page or those few paragraphs get out. That was an admission that there is an indictment. That's not a question anymore. The government has admitted that there's an indictment or a criminal complaint, most likely an indictment. Indictment being from a grand jury. What they're arguing, the government, is that we cannot release this because he may flee. That's one of the arguments, which is so absurd because he doesn't. There's no way he's going to flee. He's staying there. If only he could. Or that the arresting officers could be in harm if he knew in advance that he was indicted.
By the way, I just want to let you know
he has guns in the embassy there. So the issue, to answer your question quickly, is the judge has not rescheduled a second hearing. Both sides, the government and this committee, have filed new motions, and they're both making their arguments why it should or should not be unsealed. Can it be dropped at any time? Well, I'm not an expert on that point, but I do think that a government could decide not to prosecute someone even if there's an indictment. I mean, I do believe they could just drop the case or come to some kind of settlement. Yeah.
Anne's been trying to speak for ages. She's been like waving her.
Okay. Yeah. Well, it's
Anne has three minutes left. Go ahead, Anne. You got the last 3 minutes.
Okay. Well, first, there are troops and air support on their way to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where there's a disputed election. And as is always the case, when the US tries to interfere in sub-Saharan Africa, they say they're going to protect the embassy and US diplomats and American property, which to them means the whole country. I have a whole lot of WikiLeaks here. I've been reading the WikiLeaks about this part of the world, which offer a lot more context than you're going to get from CNN, which reported this. CNN kept comparing it to Benghazi. So I'm going to be writing about some of these. And one of the only things I think I can do is to keep writing about WikiLeaks that relate to the things that I particularly try to understand. And I made this other list of things that I'm doing or planning to do. One is, again, to try to contact this EU parliamentarian, Rosa Strauss. That's the only, high-level legislator that I have any contact with who might conceivably join the other EU parliamentarians. And then, as I said, I'm organizing a forum at the Berkeley Unitarian Universalist Church. And at that, I might see if we can get a group together who are willing to go to the office of Representative Barbara Lee, our District 13 California congressional rep. And then the other thing I wanted to talk about was every week after the vigils, I've been grabbing some of the audio and putting them into these KPFA news reports, which I then post to SoundCloud and I post them to my Twitter page. But I also post them to something called the Pacifica Audio Port, which is for sharing news around the Pacifica Radio Network. And the people who most consistently download my news reports are the Portland, Ashland, Oregon, Kansas City, and Moscow, Idaho stations. There are others, and there are more people download my Assange reports than most anything else I've been producing.
Moscow. That sounds like collusion to me. There's some connection to Moscow.
Yes, it's Radio Free Moscow. Yes,
Radio Free Moscow and Moscow, Idaho. Okay.
Yes.
Well, Anne, I want to thank you. Kathy, thanks a lot for coming on. Vivian, we are ending our program, but I can't give you. I can't leave it. I'll give you one more chance to say something else if you want to.
I'm happily eating salad here. So,
Okay.
But
Well,
I
really great to have you on for the whole show. I really appreciate that. Thanks to Ray and Margaret Kimberly before. And we will see you next week. The details of that will be coming out shortly. So thanks everybody for watching. Bye-bye now.
Bye.
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 Bye.